Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And live from the divided states of America, it is time now for another 3 hours of the most disruptive show in American politics, in the politically independent corner. I am investigative radio show host and political analyst Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And without further ado, you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get into it. First up, we have the headlines, then we have Jamarl's monologue, then we're taking calls. That's at 7:15 in about 15 minutes. But let's do the headlines. Stimulus talks on the brink of collapse. This comes despite weeks of negotiations and a pitched 3-hour meeting yesterday between administration officials and Democratic Party leaders. The administration says it will take executive action on Friday, that's today, if it doesn't see more progress on these talks. Again, though, this comes as just a week ago, unemployment benefits faded out for tens of millions of Americans. This is a big problem. We'll see where this goes. But the fact that these aren't going well does not bode well for the economy, or that matter for the election. Not that either of those matter quite as much as the tens of millions of lives potentially thrust into uncertainty here. Certainly thrust into uncertainty here, I should say. Trump has also signed, other news, Trump has signed executive orders prohibiting U.S. residents from doing business with TikTok and WeChat. Those are set to begin 45 days from now. That prohibition is set to begin 45 days from now. China, sort of in a response, reassured the world that it is not the Soviet Union and has no intention of becoming another United States. So sort of mixed messaging there. This also comes as Microsoft has been in long-term sort of recent chats, big chats with WeChat, with TikTok, specifically ByteDance, the owners of TikTok, to see about purchasing TikTok and basically Americanizing it. Trump had pushed back on that idea originally. He's kind of come around in the last week, it seems, and now sort of somewhat supports it. New York's Attorney General Letitia James. This is a big story. We didn't know exactly what this was going to be about. She announced an announcement. Then yesterday she came out. It was about the NRA. So New York's AG Letitia James is going after the NRA on the grounds of years of runaway corruption and misspending. So is DC's Attorney General Carl A. Racine for allowing charitable funds to be used for non-charitable purposes, failing to operate independently, and placing the NRA's interests ahead of its own charitable purposes. In our next story, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine tested positive, then negative for COVID-19, for the coronavirus. So it seemed like he'd gotten it, and then he took a test later in the day that showed that he didn't have it. So we'll see that he could take more, and it could either confirm it or disconfirm it. We'll see where that goes. America, this is according to the Bloomberg Economic Misery Index. America will have fallen 25 slots in the Bloomberg Economic Misery Index, dropping from number 25 employment on a sort of two-dimension graph there, and apparently, America's just not doing all that well. It hadn't been doing all that well before. It was, again, out of 60 countries at number 25. Now it has dropped to number 50. That's due, of course, to a huge rise in unemployment recently. Also, the threat of prolonged inflation. Some people are worried about. The U.S. has changed its travel guidelines, removes advice that Americans avoid all foreign travel. Basically, we had all foreign travel in the sort of strongest possible recommendation that you don't travel, in the level 4 travel guidance, basically. You shouldn't go anywhere. Now we've sort of stepped that down for pretty much every country. We have different listings for different countries. So, for instance, Taiwan would be a higher level. It's more permitted. It's more recommended that people travel there. Some other countries, for instance, China, be a very, very low level, although, of course, China isn't accepting most foreign travel at this point. The point here is that America has basically changed its recommendations. It hasn't changed its visa policies with a lot of these countries, either as prohibitions on other countries coming in, nor can it, of course, change other countries allowing us to come in. But in terms of its recommendations, it's now saying that people can basically travel. It's no longer disrecommending that everybody travel. On Wednesday, by the way, this is a couple of days ago, but the Virginia Department of Health launched COVID-Wise. That was the first app developed in the States that uses Apple and Google's COVID-19 contact tracing technology. So again, this came on Wednesday. This is a couple of months late. Apple and Google had rolled out their API for developing this stuff 3-4 months ago. It's been a while at this point. I forget exactly when they launched that, but other nations have started to develop apps. I remember Switzerland, Italy fairly early on. Anyway, this is the first state. This is the first U.S. published app, basically, for a larger civic body like a state. And we'll see how it goes. In our next story, Mohammed bin Salman apparently sent a hit squad to take down former spy Saad al-Jabri in Canada. This at least comes according to a lawsuit filed by Jabri, alleging that bin Salman sent this hit squad. Apparently, this would have happened about 13 days after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And apparently the squad that was sent to kill Jabri, the Tiger Squad, according to his allegations, is the same squad that was sent to kill Khashoggi. So it's called the Tiger Squad. Apparently they were arrested at the Canadian border on their entry into Canada with tools and implements that seem associated with assassination and destruction, attempting to kill somebody. So it's interesting to see this kind of thing breaking through into the sort of mass media. Anyway, moving on. Melbourne is apparently on lockdown. Things are spiraling there. We'll have more on that in the next week, but they've gone into a sort of second severe phase of lockdown recently. Australia is an interesting case. I'd like to talk more about it at some point. When it comes to COVID, their numbers have been exceptionally low for a long time. They've seen some, rolling growth over recent months, but they've managed to keep their numbers very low, especially compared to the United States, and especially compared to the level of lockdown they had implemented. I'd like to look back into them, but that's all for now. In our next story, Twitter has added labels to all state-backed accounts. They didn't. This is at least what the sort of headline read. They didn't do it to us, though. So it's supposed to. Whether you're a U.S. account or a Chinese account or a Russian account or whatever, Venezuelan, German, Twitter is now supposed to label that in the same way that they label information. But we're a Russian government-funded media operation, and I go to Twitter and I don't see us. I don't see Faultlands Radio tagged. Anyway, I feel left out. I feel slighted. I feel sniped. But you know what? That's almost my last story. My last story here today, last but not least, definitely not least, 4 victims of terminal cancer in Canada can now legally take magic mushrooms before they die. So this is a sort of end-of-life potential treatment option. This is not being pursued as a treatment option. It's just that four people in Canada with terminal cancer can now legally take this drug to go through some sort of holistic, renewing end-of-life experience. Anyway, this is actually, in my opinion, a kind of weird big step. It's interesting that this exemption is being allowed. We'll see if this picks up any speed in the Canadian political process. We've had Adam Eidinger before talking about the legalization, not just of marijuana, but of other entheogenic drugs like magic mushrooms, for instance. Again, just interesting to see Canada doing this. With that out of the way, that is headlines. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, Jamarl, what is your top priority for your monologue today?
That's a great story. I love that. I don't think those things should be illegal anyway. And you have a person who's going to the end of their life. Yeah, I don't even know why that's controversial. So great story on that one.
Right.
The thing I wanted to talk about today, though, parenting under the best of scenarios is a difficult process. And in our country, it's made that much more difficult. You have overt actions, things that the parent does that tries to enforce or to put something in that kid in order to keep that kid safe, in order to help that kid later on in life. Meaning the logic that kid functions on, the workable point of view that you help push that kid to. You want that to be something that betters that kid over the course of their life, not necessarily take them to horrible and bad ends. Well, even beforehand, though, before everything that just took place, meaning from the standpoint of COVID, you had what? The majority of people living paycheck to paycheck, the majority not having $500 in a bank, and nearly half in poverty. And that's trying to raise a kid under difficult circumstances where you as a parent are pretty much left to your own devices. Add to that for the moment, however, COVID, and the situation becomes that much more difficult and that much more dire in some cases. You have some parents that got ill. You had some parents that had to deal with kids that got sick, not to mention the bills that the parents had to pay. But even more interesting, school, something that is ever present and yet has become somewhat of a point of contention. Right now, we are sending kids back to school. The Trump administration wants to do that. Now, my belief has more to do with Trump trying to push people back into work and trying to make the COVID thing as if it's not that big of a deal, in which case we want to push the kids back to school to give this kind of indication of such. But is it safe? Now, Betsy DeVos cannot give a clear understanding and guidelines under which people could follow to ensure that their kids remain safe, to remain whole. And if you are a parent, I care about my dogs remaining whole. I can totally understand how a parent would be concerned about whether or not their kids will remain safe or healthy while going and get an education. Put aside for the moment the parents that lost their jobs. Even put aside for the moment the kids that were going to school because they needed to eat because of poverty or issues of poverty. When you really get into the nub of it, the real bottom line question, is it safe to go back to school? And our government has not given us a yes. In fact, Betsy DeVos made a point of saying, well, look, there's all sorts of information, all sorts of studies out there. These schools can come up with their own way of figuring out how to do it. What do you mean they can come up with their own way of how to do it? You're trying to force those kids back to school. The least you can do is ensure those kids are safe. In Mississippi, 100 students were quarantined. Now, if you remember, Donald Trump put out a tweet that was taken down, basically saying the kids are basically immune. I have no idea where he got that from, and yet he said that. Well, over 100 people quarantined in Mississippi school district after several tests positive for COVID-19. At least 116 people, this is NBC News, at least 116 people in Mississippi school districts have been instructed to self-quarantine for 14 days after 6 students and 1 staff member have tested positive for the coronavirus less than 2 weeks after the school opened. Of the 7 people who have tested positive since class resumed, July 27th in Corinth, a city in the state's east corner, 5 are high school students, 1 attends middle school, and the other is a staff member. The district spokeswoman and a nurse and others have been working, quote unquote, diligently to ensure the safety of staff and students through routine screenings and new building procedures. Contact tracing and seating charts have been vital to our quarantine process, Combs said. She also said that all students and staff in the district, which has enrolled 2,700, were wearing masks even before the state's governor announced Tuesday that it would require all students or all children and adults in schools to wear face coverings. Now, this is the superintendent, by the way, Combs. Look, whatever I think of this, at the very least, they had processes in place to try to pull these people apart in quarantine, even though I think the idea of sending kids back to school in this situation, I'm sorry, is obscene, especially if you can come up with other means and measures in order to figure out how to do schooling safely, even if it's temporarily ensuring that these kids stay home, even if it's giving textbooks or notebooks or notepads and all of these other things to ensure that those kids can do that work remotely if they indeed need to do that work remotely. Cross over this with a story that is coming out in Georgia. Now, a picture widely distributed from a Georgia school, North Paulding High School in Dallas, Georgia, basically showed kids in their habitat going about their day. But few of them were wearing masks, barely any of them. And again, kids are not immune to this, and those kids have parents, those kids have teachers and whatnot that are absolutely susceptible, even if there's a belief that students aren't as susceptible. A 15-year-old student in North Pauling, Hannah Waters, was suspended for 5 days after posting this image, meaning her exposing the fact that these kids are walking around without masks on and that kids are not immune to this and that this can be a particular haven for this disease to transfer itself. The issue wasn't that the procedures weren't to ensure that those kids were safe. No, the issue was that she revealed it. She gets punished. She gets punished. Look, it is problematic to me that kids have to go back. It is problematic to me that they have to go back in conditions that are potentially unsafe. It is worse still when it is revealed and the person who reveals it gets punished. Maybe that's a good lesson for getting older. That is a horrible lesson that you want to teach a kid. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You know what? I'll throw this out. We're taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. 202-521-1320 again is the number to call. If you just so happen to be in the Washington, D.C. area, you can listen to us there on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. Again, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. You're on the line. What's going on, Tarif?
All right, good morning, gentlemen. I have 3 comments to say this morning, but before I get in my comments, Jamarl and other people that have YouTube platforms, y'all might want to start looking at other platforms to put your videos on too. As you post on YouTube, post on other platforms like Facebook and others, maybe like Big Shoot. Okay, Judge calls for Assange testimony in civil suit against Fox News over sex witch article. I shared that article with y'all tweet for today. The U.S. is scrutinizing Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is working with China on a nuclear program. All right? So that, somewhat leading east. And yesterday, I was watching Dale Big Tree on the High Wire, and it was talking about Sweden and how Sweden had an open policy, no lockdown policy, and how their debt rate was still the same as everybody else that locked down, and how their debt rate was like lower than Spain, France, and Germany, Belgium, and other people, even though they didn't lock down. And what the scientists was saying yesterday on the show was saying basically they was reaching herd immunity. The thing is, like, the virus is already out here, so when you open up, what's going to happen? You're going to have a spike because you didn't reach herd immunity. But what he was also saying was this. I'm trying to place it all together what Dale Bigtree was saying and the scientists. They were saying, like, you have to reach herd immunity, but at the same time, you got to take care of those that's at risk, which means the elderly, those with comorbidities like diabetes, cancers and things like that. So when they get sick, you have to treat them. But if you're constantly locking down, then releasing people back to the open again was going to happen. You're always going to see spikes because people's immune systems is not getting accustomed to the COVID-19. It made sense. It's kind of controversial still, but I just posted that article from Newsweek and also the Dale Bigtree High Tile show to y'all post your tweets for today. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Arif. Yeah, thanks for sending that stuff. I appreciate it. I mean, a quick note on the last point you were talking about, Del Bigtree talking about herd immunity and the sort of yo-yo where when you reopen after having imposed a lockdown, you're going to see a spike in cases. And you're pointing out that the countries, I'll just single out Sweden here. Tegnell, I'm forgetting his first name, but I think it's Anders Tegnell, the chief epidemiologist in Sweden. He took the pretty controversial tact earlier on, as a lot of people know, of not putting Sweden into a full lockdown. Basically, the government used a pretty light hand, but there was a heavy social response where people just culturally were choosing to either stay home or choosing to sort of social distance and do that thing. You heard about some of that stuff. If you look in Sweden, there wasn't no response, but the government's response was categorically different than a lot of others in the region. And Sweden has seen more cases and more deaths than its neighbors, but also a lot less cases and deaths than some of its neighbors to the south, some of its non-contiguous neighbors. So it's actually doing worse than all of its immediately neighboring countries in Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, Finland, but it's doing a decent amount better in some cases than other countries on the continent. I mean, there's part of that. Part of what's confusing the situation in the United States is that we started off, once we started to take this virus a little bit more seriously, there was the thing with flattening the curve, where probably everybody will remember like those charts going around and those graphs, the idea being you need to keep the sort of saturation in the population. You need to keep the virus low enough so that the hospitals don't get overwhelmed, and you'll always have sort of excess capacity at the hospitals to take on people who are becoming critically ill. And that was what flattening the curve was basically all about. It wasn't about completely stopping the spread. It was slowing the spread so that you had enough capacity at hospitals. That seems to be the sort of reigning policy. That seems to be the mode that the United States has gone into, is like preparing for slow and constant growth, but trying to maintain capacity at hospitals. The problem with that, I mean, that's, in itself as a strategy, that's a strategy. It's not a non-strategy. It has its place. The problem with that is that we're pairing that with wanting to reopen the economy. And so you have those two needs kind of cutting against each other. And another thing that confused this, I think, is that a lot of people were looking to the flatten the curve strategy. They were expecting that could really help to like knock out the virus. But as far as I can tell, that was never the expectation. The expectation was only that you would keep it low enough in these sort of waves that Tarif was describing, where when you reopen, people were flushed back out into the economy and you had more of the virus spreading. I think we didn't know what to expect. The communication, the messaging around that from the government and just in general was a little bit unclear. But yeah, flattening the curve, the idea there is that you're going to have the virus continuing to spread. What isn't really included actively in that conversation, or at least wasn't when I saw that stuff going around, was this idea of reaching herd immunity. Now that's complicated because we don't know actually if you can reach herd immunity. We're kind of assuming that you can. And there's some evidence with like lower mortality rates and stuff as time has gone on that has actually worked. But there are also questions about how long the immunity to this virus lasts, how quickly it's going to mutate, and therefore how quickly, we're going to need to build up our immunity again. There are all those issues. Anyway, Jamarl, what's your take? He'd also asked you about YouTube. He'd mentioned YouTube and going to other media channels. You want to comment on that, Jamarl?
Yeah, that has been on the agenda. I think I've had a conversation with Rockfin to see if I can get a channel there. In fact, I was supposed to actually contact them last week. But yeah, that's at this point, I think that has to be done. I don't know any other way around it. I mean, you can't trust YouTube. I mean, they basically want cat videos, or they would have something like ABC News or NBC News or some of these just mainstream news channels that, for whatever reason, they think people go online in order to watch. So yeah, he's right. Tarif is absolutely right. Also, we have John from Baton Rouge. John, what's going on?
Hey, hi guys. So you guys kind of dropped the ball on the Beirut catastrophe the other day, and that kind of convinced me that neither one of you probably go to the to William Montague's blog called Moon of Alabama, because he explained that very, very clearly exactly what had gone on. Well, first of all, it wasn't ammonium sulfide that blew up; it was ammonium nitrate. And you guys ought to look into ammonium nitrate explosions for one thing, because about every 50 years a warehouse will blow and take out, do damage for literally miles around. So it's a common sort of thing that happens sort of infrequently. So basically what happened in this, just to clarify it before you go to moonofalabama.org, and William Montague is amazing. But anyway, he documented this very well. There was a warehouse close to the one that had the ammonium nitrate in it, and it had fireworks in it, and apparently it had a breach of some sort, broken fence or something like that, that was allowing access. I'm guessing kids were probably stealing fireworks or something like that. He didn't say that, but that's probably what was going on. So welders were repairing that, and the sparks from the welding caused a fire in that warehouse that was storing the fireworks. And the fireworks warehouse blew, and that caused the warehouse basically close to it that had the ammonium nitrate to go. So that's what actually happened.
Now,
So I just
what
want
if this?
to be clear here. I wrote the headlines up and I just went back to check. I didn't have it as ammonium sulfide. I had it as ammonium nitrate. We got
That's
that.
what I thought.
We got that right.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yesterday, I heard you say ammonium sulfide, but anyway.
Might have said that. I don't remember saying that, honestly. I have it in the headlines, and I think of it as ammonium nitrate. Originally, I got it as sodium nitrate because it had been described. It had come out in early headlines, sodium nitrate. But I don't think I ever said that on the air. And that's not sulfide. That's nitrate. But regardless, I don't want to be defensive there. I haven't heard of the Moon of Alabama blog that you were talking about. It sounds like the sort of unique thing they were adding was that it was in a separate warehouse. The fire sort of spread through the fence like you're talking about, but that it was in another building. And it seems like the reporting right now has been that it was contained in the same building as the firecrackers. So.
Yeah. Well, we have Mike. We have Leith Marouf coming on to talk about it later. So we'll get further into it.
We'll get into it totally.
And yeah, and he's in Beirut, so he can definitely give us a little bit more I guess, clarity on what was taking place there. I mean, when the story first came out, it was kind of fluid. And you had, I think if I remember correctly, I noted that Donald Trump said something about it being an attack, and that Beirut was looking for Donald Trump to explain what they mean by attack, because up to that point, there was no necessary evidence of it. I think we even gave context that Israel and Beirut and Lebanon had been in conflict. And so the notion that you could just say, it's something that wasn't necessarily pertinent to the conflict, I don't think you can do that. I think this is one of those things that information comes out on, and you just try to get more information as it goes on. So, but I appreciate the call. And then, like I said, Marouf will be here. He's in Beirut, and he can give us a little bit more details on what is going on. But that's fair. The story that caught my eye this morning was the Saudi one. Basically, where Salman put out a contract on the guy in Canada, in Toronto, and tried to have that guy also basically chopped up, apparently with a bone saw. I don't know if it was a bone saw. I'm just being trite. But that's astonishing. Like, to believe that you could send a hit squad in countries like that. Now, to be fair, the U.S. does renditions. And we've gotten caught doing renditions. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was in Italy where the person actually got prosecuted for it. But Saudi Arabia doing this, especially after they had a guy chopped up with a bone saw. And that story, by the way, for the bone saw thing, went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Everywhere where we went to around the world, that story was up. And to immediately go in and try to do something similar again, it's so weird.
So you were, just a real quick question, you were traveling at the time from what you're saying, right?
Yeah, we were traveling, and everywhere we went, every country
and you
we
were
jumped
seeing
into,
it everywhere. That's
everywhere.
Really interesting.
Everywhere we went,
I could see that.
Because it was all over Europe.
Makes sense. I could see that as the story that kind of crosses around the world. It's pretty visceral. It's international. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Whether it was Muslim countries or European countries, it was the same thing. The Europeans were getting very angry and upset about it, even though they wouldn't necessarily take any real action about it. Muslim countries were showing the same thing with a certain degree of consternation about it. It was shocking, to put it mildly. And yeah, the world took notice. And so the notion that they were going to do this again, very shortly after the first one is amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll be back in a minute. We're going into the break. We'll be joined in just a minute by Manila Chan. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Tune in every Friday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a weekly segment of the worst mainstream media headlines of the week. They tell us what's behind the worst, most misleading, and funniest headlines from around the news with Steve Patt of the blog Left Eye on the News. Together, they pull apart the corporate media's bias, spin, and downright lies. Tune in this Friday and every Friday for the worst and most misleading headlines of the week.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are joined for this segment and the next by Manila Chan, veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program In Question. Manila, how are you doing this morning?
Hi, good morning, guys.
Hey, good morning.
How are you?
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, we're doing well. So we brought you on. We're talking today about schools reopening, the situation with homeschooling potentially, but also the specifics of how schools are reopening, whether and when, as schools reopen across the country, kids should be going back to them. We'll start there. We can get into the election too. But what's your take on the reopening process, Manila? Just real quick.
Right. I think right now the reopening process, I think a lot of schools have really still been scrambling to get a plan of action together and how they are going to, if they come back in person, if they're going to have the space to space children 6 feet apart, at least 3 is what I'm hearing from various states and teachers that I actually know. And they're shutting off water fountains, things like that, things that are high touch surfaces. Those are the things that are being floated out there. But what's more concerning to me is that they're treating all children of school age, grade pre-K through 12, they're treating them the same. And I think that is more concerning to me as both, obviously a member of the community and a parent myself, because the way coronavirus impacts children, pediatric coronavirus is not only extremely rare, but the way it is expressed in children varying on their ages is very different. And I think school boards and various teachers unions, they have to consider that as well.
So then one way actually to tie this in, I'm curious, what did you think about Trump's comments about kids being almost immune? To Twitter, Facebook, they took down videos for his Trump campaign page account on Twitter, his personal page on Facebook, video of him saying that kids are almost immune. I mean, technically, my take on that very briefly, technically there's kind of it's a little bit wrong, but from what you're saying, I also kind of agree, and I can see why he would have said that if the rate's that much lower. What's your take on that? Do you think that applies?
Yeah, actually, I don't think the president is that wrong there. I think he has a history, obviously, of saying some very glib remarks. So I think people kind of brush off whatever he says and says it's wrong. But in this case, with pediatric COVID, he's not wrong. It is, here in the U.S., according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, their report summary from July 30th, this is information provided by 49 states, mind you. There were less than 350,000 kids that have tested positive, and that's anywhere from newborn up to age 18. That's, 338,000 to be exact have tested positive, and less than 1% of those had any severe illness or symptoms. Even a smaller subset than that needed hospitalization, something like 0.6%. So those kids already had underlying conditions that are consistent with adult comorbidity. And, in those states that did report, anywhere from 0 to 0.03, I don't know how they arrive at that, but 0 to 0.03 reporting resulted in any death. So they're not being specific about the ages there, but that's according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. So with President Trump saying the risk is almost 0 of severe illness or death, he's not wrong there.
Another big side of this, though, I think, is the sort of infection. Is that kids going back to school, if they're picking up the coronavirus, they're going to be spreading that at home. What's your take on that? If they're bringing that virus back to their family, back to particularly older members of their family, this idea that this is one side of the economy that we're trying to reopen, and obviously this is pivotal. If you're the parent of a kid and you don't have time because you're having to take care of them during the days to go back to work, if you can't go back to work, basically, this is going to be that threshold that once you're over it, you're doing a lot better. But on the other side of that, if they're bringing COVID back home, if you're potentially going to get sick, or if your parents, you the parent, if your parents are going to get sick because you're bringing it to them, what's your take on that issue, Manila?
Well, you're right. I mean, the issue is partially will children get sick, and the other part is will children get other people sick. So based on a large study, I forget how many tens of thousands of kids in South Korea, they paint a pretty complicated picture with, again, going back to the age variables in children, that children over the age of 10 are the ones that are more likely to spread. If they have the virus, they could be asymptomatic or what have you, or show very little symptoms. But it's children over the age of 10 who can spread the virus as much as any adult. And the theory from that is that until around middle school, humans don't really have their angiotensin converting enzymes. Your body doesn't really kick that in until about middle school. Now, your ACE1 and ACE2, those are the enzymes that cause your muscles near your arteries to dilate, so it narrows the veins, it increases blood pressure or what have you. And that's why children obviously aren't really diagnosed with high blood pressure or things that adults tend to get that come with age. So it's kind of a complicated, muddy issue there, is that, again, should you treat all school-age children the same? Can children get sick? Yes. Can children get adult sick? Yes. But now let's look at the subset of children. If we in the U.S. have been pushing, for that First 5 program, right? They've been saying this for years. First 5 is the first 5 years of life are the most crucial learning years in a child's development. And if those children from 0 to age 5 are stuck at home, they need to be in school. They're not getting anything from online learning. I mean, for them, it's kind of like watching TV or YouTube, right? They get very little from online learning. So they need the human interaction. They need the socialization. They need the tactility of, touching blocks and looking through books. And mind you, a lot of kids don't have internet access anyway, but that's a whole different ball of wax that we can get into. But again, they really need to look at what age school-age children should go back to school, more quickly, and who can be staved off for a little while longer. So I would argue that children from, I would consider 7th or 8th grade and above, if schools and teachers unions are truly concerned about, the spread and between other students and the spread with teachers and them bringing that home as well, then consider the age of the children. But the little ones are the ones that are being hurt the most by this, because many of them are home. Many of them don't have internet. Many of them don't have parents who can be actively involved in teaching, say, a kindergartner, a first grader, whose development is really, really tied to the direct social development aspect of what we would call school, including nap time, believe it or not.
Yeah, I just want to come in real quick, Jamarl. I don't want to cut you off, but with that, two quick points here, and then I'll hand it over to you, Jamarl. The ACE2, the enzyme, and I'm not a cellular biologist. I haven't learned this stuff while this has been going on, and I certainly didn't know it before. But I know ACE2 is basically this enzyme that certain types of cells can use for like cellular chemical signaling and energy and stuff. Anyway, COVID binds to some cells more than others, and it has to do with ACE2. So it's interesting to hear. I actually had heard whispers of this, but from what you're saying, I should be looking into it more. That kids.
There's a study in South Korea. Sorry to cut you off.
Go for it. What'd you say, Manila?
Sorry to cut you off, but it's it seems like the South Koreans are really looking into that, and that's where this study that I've reviewed came from, is that they're saying that kids over the age of 10, their bodies aren't really expressing that hormone yet, or that enzyme rather. So it seems like there's less risk involved for kids age 10 and under.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I want to look into that. Thanks for that further direction. Another very quick note here before I pass it to Jamarl. It's just the sort of tiered strategy that you're talking about, where younger kids go back and then older kids, there's more flexibility. That actually makes a lot of sense from the parents' perspective. Again, looking at it just from the sort of pragmatic daycare end of things, your older kids you're going to expect could be a lot more independent. You can leave them at home on their own. They're probably going to be able to take care of themselves. And that's going to be fine. So I could see that doing a lot to alleviate the whole conversation here. It's just weird, again, that like on a day-to-day basis, we're having to get familiar with some of the basics of cellular biology just to have a sort of educated conversation on these issues. It's a little bit confusing. But before I get ahead of myself, Jamarl, do you want to chime in, Jamarl?
Yeah, Manila, welcome back to the show. So I think I can agree with the tiered strategy thing. If the research does come back and show that, look, having kids who are 10 and under, they're less prone to potential illness, fair enough. And if we can also accept that kids who are older have a greater propensity for illness or pass it just as much as adults, then I do think at the very least, a conversation needs to be started around ensuring that those kids are safe and not having a situation that isn't taking place in either Mississippi or in Georgia, with these kids who are basically shoved into school. And there's no reason to believe that there's going to be any level of social distancing among the kids. There's not even a reason to believe that they'll be wearing masks per se. They're kids. They don't necessarily have this great idea of expectations of potential consequences for their actions. But I do want to get to one point, though. The teachers. I mean, the teachers, the staff, even if the kids who are under 10, and I would still say we don't know this as a flat fact, but even if the kids under 10 are less likely to pass it, isn't there something to be said about the teachers or the staff that themselves can be susceptible to the illness? And how should that be mitigated? Meaning, if you want to make the argument the kids should be sent back under a particular age, okay, but who's going to teach those kids, and how are those kids going to be taught in a way that's safe for the staff that's there?
Well, on that note, I agree with you. Those pictures that came out of Georgia in those crowded hallways, those were appalling. And the fact that the school did not implement a mandatory mask for, I mean, those to me look like either, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, older students, right? Kids that know better, that you can tell them you have to wear a mask. I mean, it'd be no different than a school dress code, right? Like pick up your pants, no sagging your pants. Well, put on a mask. So from what I understand, those schools whose pictures we saw, they didn't have a mandatory mask requirement in place. Now, that said, going to the teachers and administrators and what have you, according to various teachers associations, the National Educators Association and what have you, these big associations, the median and average teacher age in the U.S. is hovering in the low 40s. So the average and the median, right? The median age is still about 40. So that's about my age. Still pretty healthy for the most part. And by and large, most teachers are younger, and younger people tend to be healthier. Now, if you are an adult, whether you're, faculty, teacher, whatever, lunch lady, if you are at a higher risk, why can't they choose to stay home? Why can't they opt out of the school year? Why can't they take leave, that should be provided to them? I'm sure unions are hastily working to get some sort of agreement like that put together. But if there is a teacher, even if she was or he was 25, 26 years old, if they are at high risk because they have some underlying comorbidity status in their health, then they should be provided the option to take a leave of absence. But I think by and large, a lot of teachers really do miss their kids and do want to get back. But I think there's a lot of pressure coming from the unions for them to all band together and push for stay-at-home education. But I do think there are a lot of teachers and a lot of parents who are supportive of the idea of them all going back. And I think a lot of teachers who truly care about their students and know that there is nothing that comes with no risk, right? I mean, you don't not drive your car or not get in the car because there's no risk of a car accident. And you get in the car and there's, a 1 in almost 1,500 chance that day that you will get in some sort of car wreck. But that doesn't mean you don't get in the car and drive.
Okay, wait, I don't want to interrupt you, but we do have to take a break. We'll be back in a moment. You've been listening to Manila Chan, veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We've been joined by Manila Chan, veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. And frankly, one of my favorite shows. Between you and Rick Sanchez, love both of you guys. So I want to get back into the question of kids going back to school. Now, I agree with you. Everything entails risk. Me getting out of bed in the morning entails a certain amount of risk. Me going to work in the morning entails a certain amount of risk. But there's a certain amount of reward associated with the risks that we kind of just make in. It's like you said, the majority of people who get into a car don't crash, even though we have a high propensity or a high number of people who do. And even our food choices, tobacco choices, etc. All sorts of things entail a certain risk that we get something out of it. I don't doubt, not for one moment, that teachers enjoy teaching their kids. I don't doubt that many of them want to get back to school. I also don't doubt, though, that many of them are concerned about their health, even if they're 20 and 30 years old. I mean, you have plenty of teachers, especially of the African-American persuasion, that had all sorts of issues like high blood pressure, diabetes, etc. And I have doubts on whether or not, if a rule is put into place that allowed kids to go back, that those teachers wouldn't be forced to go back to their classrooms, just like many of the other jobs that people were being forced back into. For example, in some of the, I believe it was Ohio, or in some of the cases where you had these food plants, where it was clear that they were spreading illness throughout those plants, and they were still pushing people to go back by preventing them from getting unemployment. You had something similar in Amazon, where they didn't want to tell people how many people were getting ill and infected. I mean, there is a problem here, right? I mean, we can't say, okay, let's send all the kids back. But we do need somebody to take care of those kids, or at the very least, have the ability to have high speed, have Wi-Fi, and those type of things. And those aren't things that the state seems to be providing, while still trying to ensure that those kids go back. And by the way, not ensuring that the staff or the teachers are protected, even if we want to make the case that kids under the age of 10 are. Like, how do you reconcile that? Because that seems to be part of the crux of it. Even if we say kids are safe, parcel to it is the kids aren't the only ones that go to school. You have janitors, staff members, people who work in IT, people who work in the office, the principals, etc. And just being in the room itself apparently ups the aerosol effect, apparently, of those people getting potentially infected. Can you think of another solution to this other than people putting themselves at risk in order to teach those kids, even if those kids are under 10?
the way you've described it, and I think that's pretty fair, is that we in the U.S. have a failure of infrastructure to support our children and our teachers, the people who take care of our kids, including daycare. Now, first, though, let's remind everybody that daycare has not shut down amid this entire pandemic. I mean, I know for a little while there, everybody was shut down, but then they realized that, first responders have kids. They need to go to work. Nurses have kids. Doctors have kids. They need to be at work saving lives. Who's going to take care of their kids? So states have, allowed daycares to take care of first responder children, and we haven't heard of any deaths from resulting from daycares being open, whether it's the children or the care provider so far. So somehow that's managing to work okay. But again, I believe because those are daycares, I'm sure there are daycare providers that have opted out from returning to work or have taken a leave of absence. And that is the failure of our infrastructure and probably the failure right now of those teachers unions to work out at least a tentative deal right now for teachers to be able to take leave. The same way a female teacher would take maternity leave. Why have they not worked out a deal for teachers to take a leave of absence due to the coronavirus? There are plenty of other teachers that can fill in, people that are currently out of work, people that are qualified to do this, substitute teachers who are waiting in the wings, waiting for an opportunity to get up to the plate and swing and play teacher. So teachers unions have a big part here to play. They can work something like that out with individual states. And I mean, I can't get into the weeds with charter schools and all those various, private schools and the different rules in different states that impact those schools. But generally speaking, why have states and teachers associations, why have they not worked out a deal where they can, at least as a cursory measure, give us a show of hands who wants to come back? Then you can go back to the parents. Ask the parents, do you want your kids to come back? I'm sure there are some parents that have the ability to stay at home with their kids, but then there are a great mass of others who can't. But those who can stay at home or want to stay at home, let them stay at home. Make it an option. I know in this area, Northern Virginia, they are, right now, they're going to, in Fairfax County anyway, are starting the school year all online. But from what I'm hearing, the rumblings on the ground is that going further into the year, that they are going to give people the option, teachers and students, and they're measuring how many people are interested in going back into a regular classroom facility. And if there's enough people and there's enough educators that are willing to do that, then they're looking at that as an option. I think that's a really good example and a good way to look at it. But it all goes back down to not only state by state, then county by county, and then district by district. And it really is a all hands on deck. You got to gauge your teachers. You got to gauge the faculty, how they feel. You've got to gauge the parents and see how they feel. Because certainly the children, we've talked a lot about the kids age 10 and under, but the older kids, here's the problem with the older kids. While they are obviously able to navigate online learning for the most part, if they have internet, the problem with the older kids when they're home and their parents are at work, the problem with older kids is that they need the social interaction as well. Those kids are reporting a higher incidence rate of depressive, mood disorders. Kids aren't taking their meds. People aren't there to kind of watch over them. Suicide has gone up with teenagers. So there's a problem there as well. But you can only do so much, right? You can't have everything coming at you from every angle. So I think it would be wise for teachers unions and individual states and individual counties to just get a show of hands. See who wants to come back, and if you have the faculty to support the number of kids that may come back. Simple as that.
Manila, everybody who's listening, you're listening to the voice of Manila Chan. She's a veteran news anchor and the host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. Noah, thanks again for joining us. We have like 4 or 5 minutes left. I want to ask this real quick, and then we can get into the election. But on the topic of education, have you heard anything about the attempts to set up and then all the controversy surrounding homeschooling pods in these conversations going on across the country? Have you heard anything about that over the past couple of weeks and past month?
Homeschooling pods? That's actually news to me. Pods.
Exactly. Yeah. So we can maybe talk about it some other time. But no, it's this interesting thing. So where people are trying to set up basically small homeschooling communities. So sort of like if trading kids with some of the parents acting as teachers, so that most of the people can get back to work. But then you can have these sort of small self-selected groups that are all sort of social distancing together. But then there are all these controversies about equal access and how this is perpetuating income inequality, because a lot of the kids from families who are essential workers, a lot of them, poor kids, there's this problem that they're going to be more likely to act as vectors for the sickness. So there are these controversies where basically rich families who are setting up these homeschooling pods are sort of pushing out poorer families who are more likely to get COVID, and the kids from those families too. So it's turning into this sort of class inequality, this whole thing. Anyway, we don't need to get into that. Just curious if you knew about that. But on the election, yesterday we were brought up this idea of preference falsification, where people will basically say they believe something or say they don't believe something when actually they kind of do. They'll hide their beliefs publicly. It seemed like this happened in 2016 with the Trump election. Do you think it's going to happen in that same way in 2020, where a lot of people who said that said they would support Biden, or sort of you would have expected them to, are secretly going to support Trump or not vote at all? Do you see that potentially, Manila?
100%. There's no way around that. I was talking with your producer, Raheem, and, I did tweet out this week, I was just mulling over the pages on Twitter and looking at President Trump's and looking at Joe Biden, and the disparity between the number of followers they have, I think, is a very true reflection of not only enthusiasm, but actual support for each of those candidates. And I think the last time I was on, we talked about how the support for Joe Biden, a lot of it comes from being anti-Trump, not necessarily I love Joe Biden. So I think Twitter is a very, very accurate portrayal of what the sentiment actually is, because nobody's going to sit there and go look, I'm going to go look at Jamarl, who he follows, right? Oh, does he follow Trump? Does he follow Biden? Obviously it's different because you guys work in radio and you probably follow a whole lot of people. But my point is, for the average person, if you hate Trump, you're most likely not going to follow him, right? But you're not going to sit there and scroll through all of your friends who they follow, and scrub through and go, I'm going to unfriend you because, you follow Donald Trump. I think, honestly, Twitter is a true reflection of what's actually happening on the ground. And I think because a lot of people on the left have been so vocal about being anti-Trump, and I think a lot of Trump supporters are actually embarrassed, ashamed, or scared to admit that they support him. I think that's a lot of the reason why a lot of people are just kind of going along with it, saying, I support Biden. But I think Twitter is a reflection of the reality.
Do you think those people just don't get out of bed in the morning? Because I've seen what you're saying. It's like 70% of people who are going for Biden are going against Trump. It's a sad, obscene state in regards to our politics. What do you think happens? Let's get your prognostication. 30 seconds. Does Trump still take it, or does Biden drag himself over the finish line?
Oof. I hate to say it, but I do think Trump is going to win again for a myriad of variable reasons. But I think a lot of it is that they call themselves the silent majority. I think it's true.
30.
The politicization of COVID and the handling of all of it has really just created a greater chasm between the left and the right.
I
And
can
I
absolutely
think
see that. Manila, sadly, we've
bill
got to
has been
go.
lost.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was the voice of Manila Chan, veteran news anchor and host on RT. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Standing on a foggy promontory, I am Shane Stranahan, your investigative radio show host and political analyst.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to some headlines. Before we get to headlines, I saw a picture that your dad did, lead it, of both of us. I've seen this picture before, but it caught me off guard the other day when I saw it. I believe it was on Twitter. Great graphics to one Leith Stranahan, so I just want to put that out there.
I'm terrified of that graphic. I'm terrified.
You say you are?
I am, yeah.
Oh, I laughed so hard. He has me with the wife beater on.
Totally, yeah. No, he has you with the wife beater on. No, it's I mean, it is impressive, and it's cool in its own way, because those are like 3D scans of us. But yeah, man, I'm terrified.
It's funny. But shout out to Lee for that. All right, so let's get to the headlines in the news, and I want to put this one in because this was such a shocking win. DSA activist Marquetta Bradshaw won a shocking victory in the Democratic Senate primary in Tennessee on Thursday, beating the Senate Democrats' preferred candidate, James Mackler, in a 5-way nominating contest. Now, aside from not being the party's favorite, that's always somewhat of a difficult way to go, she only raised $8,400 and $8,420 this year, compared to Mackler's $2.1 million for the race. That's astonishing. So good job for her in that win. Stimulus talks are reportedly on the brink of collapse despite weeks of negotiations and a pitched 3-hour meeting between administrative officials and Democratic leaders. The administration says it will take executive action today, if Congress doesn't pass a bill. I am so looking forward to that because I want to see whether the president actually has that authority to pull that off. Trump signs executive orders prohibiting U.S. residents from doing business with TikTok and WeChat beginning 45 days from now. Separately, China reassured that it is not the Soviet Union and has no intention of becoming another United States. Ohio's Governor Mike DeWine tested positive for coronavirus yesterday, then tested negative. The initial announcement came shortly after a planned meeting between Governor DeWine and President Trump. The United States has topped 2,000 COVID-19 deaths in 24 hours for the first time in 3 months. Wow, that number is shocking. New York's Attorney General Letitia James is going after the NRA on grounds of years of runaway corruption and misspending. So is DC's Attorney General Carl A. Racine, accusing the NRA of allowing charitable funds to be used for non-charitable purposes, failing to operate independently, and placing the NRA's interests ahead of its own charitable purposes. California's Alameda County is giving everyone who tests positive and who needs to stay home a stipend of $1,250. The county has set aside $10 million, which would be enough to cover the stipends. According to Bloomberg, America will have fallen 25 slots in the Economic Misery Index, which combines measures of unemployment and inflation. America has dropped from its position at number 25 to number 50. There are only 60 countries on that list. The United States has lifted its do not travel guidelines by removing advice that Americans avoid all foreign travel. Wow, that's amazing. Screw the rest of the world. We got to get these people out. On Wednesday, the Virginia Department of Health launched COVIDwise, an app that uses Apple and Google COVID-19 contact tracing technology. They're the first state to have launched an app based on Apple and Google's API. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman hit squad on former spy Salad al-Jabri in Canada. Jabri's alleged that MBS sent a hit squad to kill him 13 days after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. The Tiger Squad, supposedly the same group that killed Khashoggi. Twitter says this has added labels to state-backed accounts and state-backed media-funded accounts. But no, not fault lines. Not fault lines. I suspect they'll get around to this. 4 victims of terminal cancer in Canada can now legally take magic mushrooms before they die. Good. You guys are listening to headlines. You guys are listening to fault lines with Thomas and Stranahan's. Those are the headlines. So, a lot of interesting stories. The 2000 one is fascinating. 2,000 cases of COVID deaths in the first time in several months. If there is nothing to get across how monstrously you have failed, it is that number. Because that number had gotten all the way down to like 700 to 600. And, you know, whatever you want to say about the issue being testing, nobody takes the test and then dies just because they took a test. If they die, it's because they were actually ill. The material conditions of this virus has expanded. And, you know, the weird part about this, if Donald Trump would have focused on the virus first and dealt with the economy second, the American public would not have blamed him. Meaning they would have said the president did everything he could. We may not necessarily like him, but he did everything he could. The economy has taken a hit. But yes, the economy has taken a hit entirely because of the virus. Meaning his preoccupation with the economic concerns of the 1% and whatnot basically dug a hole for him. Because in dealing with those concerns of that small body of 1%, you basically abandon the concerns and the needs of the rest of the country. Shane, how do you view this? So, I mean, the 2,000 deaths thing is obscene. And it just seems like it's somewhat of a betrayal of any notion of a social contract to prioritize a small body of the economic or political class while avoiding or ignoring the welfare of the rest of the population. That number is indicting just from a experiential standpoint. What say you?
You know my stance on some of this stuff. I mean, I don't like how the administration has handled this. On the other hand, Trump, I don't think it's as simple as if he had prioritized preventing sickness at the expense of the economy, the public might not have indicted him, at least at first, but the media sure would have, and then a large swath of the public would have followed 100%.
Wait, that's interesting. You think so? So you think the media would have? Because what it looks like, it seems like the media has taken more on the side of, oh my God, look at all these people dead. And even like CNN runs the death total constantly. It's like the death clock right beside everything that takes place. So do you think they would have flipped
if we didn't have those numbers? Yeah, if we didn't have those death numbers, which we wouldn't have in this counterfactual where we had successfully fought off the coronavirus, if we didn't have those death numbers, all we would have would be the economic numbers, and those would be pinned on Trump 100%.
Interesting.
Those numbers would probably be worse than they are now, and that's all we would have, and that would be what's defining, at least as far as I can tell, that's what would define the election cycle. Now it's the
You're basically saying he's damned if he do, damned if he did.
Yeah, kind of, and that's not even a real justification. I'm not justifying what he did, because I think that he should have prioritized certainly a smarter exit, more of like, we're talking about flattening the curve earlier, and the difference between flattening the curve and these other models of stopping it. One of the models that came out pretty quickly was you either flatten the curve, you don't do anything, or you do what they called the hammer, which is like real sharp, quick lockdown where you really try to actually stop it instead of just slowing it. If we had done that, that's hard to do. That might have been effective. That might have had some limited effect. The problem with that, of course, is other countries, the virus still might be circulating there, and that just over time you get these hotspots, and you're having to put up more and more defensive measures and more travel bans and all this stuff over time. So it's a problematic any way you go about it. Like, this is a global pandemic. Any individual country is going to be exposed to the extent that it exposes itself, and we're a very tourism heavy economy, so we don't want to have travel bans imposed on us or impose travel bans on ourselves. I don't know. It's complicated in any direction. I didn't want to throw that in to defend Trump so much as, I mean, you could say I was doing that, but really what I wanted to do is just say, hey, if he had done exactly what you were saying, I'd be tactful, because the economy would have fallen, and that's one of the, in an election cycle, that's a huge factor that people are looking at, obviously, is how well the economy is doing. So definitely that would have been used against him.
No, that may be fair. I just know that as it is now, when people look at it and you ask the public, what should the president prioritize? Health of people or the economy? And they say health. And if you notice, when this first happened, for the longest time, Trump numbers didn't drop. I remember when we were on Political Misfits, we would look at the numbers as like, how on earth is he withstanding this? All of these people are dying, and he's just kind of up there lying and obfuscating and pretending like this isn't happening. And I think the truth of it was that America was giving him leeway. I think the public said, look, this is a crisis. This is something that is unprecedented in regards to the way it happened. And for a Republican Party to want to give anything is shocking in and of itself. But these guys, the Republican Party was the one that came out and said, we're going to give X amount of dollars in order to try to bolster the economy and everything else. That gave some level of severity in regards to what was going on. But I guess the public, I think, would have given him leeway. I don't think, look, the media would have been against Trump regardless, so fair enough. And they would have looked for anything in order to pin on him. Fair enough. And if the economy took a hit, at the very least, Trump could point and say, look, the issue was the virus. We needed to deal with the virus first. I'm your president. I'm going to make sure that you guys are maintained, that you guys are made whole, that your health care is paid for with the virus stuff. All of those things, I would argue, would have ensured that Trump would have won this election, even with the economy sagging. I really do believe they would have given him the benefit of the doubt. Now, the question becomes, like you said, the media. What story would they have harped on? And yeah, it probably would have been the economic numbers. They probably would have hit it over and over and over again.
Yeah, I see no reason why they would have given him the benefit of the doubt. You're acting like we exist in normal times, but the point is that Trump is, for all of his problems, for all the criticism I have of him, he is like the only standing major political figure in the United States who sort of continuously seems to defy the establishment, even if it's volatile, even if it's just in his own way, even if you can say that it's dangerous. I think literally he is basically the only high figure person on that level. I don't know who else you would look to. For some reason, the next person that comes to mind is somebody like Rand Paul in a lot of cases. Yeah. But he's much lower down. The president, huge. I mean, obviously, president of the United States. So I don't see why they would have given him the benefit of the doubt. The media, as the mouthpieces of the establishment, at least the establishment media, why would they do that?
Well, no, not the media, the public.
Every chance.
I'm talking about the public. Like, when this first happened, the public really did suspend belief. I mean, I think it's kind of like when George Bush with 9/11, where the public gives the president a certain amount of time to try to work it out. And the public kind of stands back before it makes a judgment one way or the other. And early on, within the first several months of this, the public did not hit Trump despite the economy going down and everything else. They started to hit Trump, meaning from the public's perception of events. After the protests, that was one. But also, when these numbers started to go back up. And you could see it in the polling. Trump's trailing of the polling. I agree with Manila Chan. I think that, and I agree with you, I think a lot of people basically don't want to give an affirmative, yes, I'm voting for Trump, for all sorts of reasons and all sorts of ideas of how the world may perceive them and giving that yes. By the same token, is that number over what Joe Biden is getting? And I have to be honest, I don't think it is. And part of the reason I don't think it is because of this. I think this is dragged and weighed on Trump kind of like an albatross around his throat because of, again, the way the public has perceived his actions. Now, the catch becomes if the economy was the one that took a hit, and let's say you didn't get 160,000 people dead. Let's say you got 70,000 people dead. Let's say we were not the number one country that this was in. And the country looked at it and say, okay, the economy has taken a hit, but they wouldn't have the knowledge of what could potentially happen with the 200,000 or the X number of 100,000 people dead. They just have the economy. And whatever Trump did, they would say Trump should have done better. So I understand where you're coming in from the standpoint of the political class. I guess my thought is the public might have responded differently, but I guess we don't know. And the only thing we have at this point is an economy that has hit the bricks and a public health sector that has also hit the bricks, meaning it's like the worst of both worlds. So yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right, Shane.
I hear you. I think I hear your point too. But yeah, we should go into a break. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Taking calls this next segment, by the way, 202-521-1320. But again, we'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number you should call if you want to call in. 202-521-1320. Also, if you want to listen to us on the radio, you can. We're on the radio. We're on live in Washington, D.C., 105.5 FM and 1390 AM in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. If you want to listen to us online, see, I'll do the full thing now, Jamarl. If you want to listen to us online, you can. Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. Those are our audio destinations. I will use that phrase, audio destinations. For our video destinations, go to YouTube. Just do a search for Fault Lines Radio and or Jamarl Thomas. Either one of those will get you to our video feed. We're going live right now. Jamarl has live video on there, a live video image of himself particularly. So if you were over on the Twitter channel, which you can also go to twitter.com/faultlinesradio, our Periscope feed is live there. If you were over on the Twitter channel and you were sort of looking at our picture on Twitter, your eyes slightly glazed over, but pleasantly happy looking at us, you can switch over to video on Jamarl's channel on YouTube, where you will see him actually moving live. No longer an animated version of himself, no longer a sort of photogrammetry thing, but him actually there. Anyway, you can find us all over the place. With that out of the way, again, we are taking calls 202-521-1320. That's the number you can call if you want to call in. Jamarl, if it were just me here, I could see myself going on a loop and just spending like 10 minutes asking people repeatedly to call in with sort of subtle variations on how I ask people. Thank goodness I'm not going to do that because you're here.
It's funny. Running a show by yourself is always a little weird. Like it's like you're looking into a camera and you're in a room by yourself and you're talking as if you're talking to somebody. That's always a little weird. And then it's like you're this awareness, kind of imperfect awareness that there's something somewhere, some person out there that's watching you in a completely different context that may or may not understand what you're saying. Yeah, it's a little heady. And callers makes it a little bit easier just because you have somebody to interact with as opposed to just kind of doing the running off at the mouth. But no, I understand. I guess I did my show for so long and I was doing it by myself that I got accustomed to it. When my wife would come on with me and we would do our contributor appreciation show, it would be nice to have somebody to kind of banter with back and forth as opposed to just kind of talking to the screen the whole time. So no, I feel
100%. 100%.
I totally feel where you're coming in.
See, you've got the experience and you put that work in out of necessity. I could go over to Periscope and I could start doing one man shows or whatever, and I'd probably get used to it after a little while. But I can tell you right now, I would be stressed. It'd be too much.
It feels weird.
Overwhelming.
Yeah.
It does feel weird.
Never stress it. Never stress it. I mean, the trick of it is there's no trick. You're just having a talk with somebody. Usually those conversations go well. Oftentimes those things are interesting, especially when those people have led somewhat different lives and come at a different perspective. But no, man, it's just doing the news. It's just part of it. You get more and more accustomed to it the more and more you do it. And, I do shows all day and all night. So I'm accustomed to it. One thing I want to talk about while we're here is the stimulus check thing. that is a breaking of the social contract. That's the way I view that. There's no other way that I view that. You have people who have given their lives, meaning their energies from the standpoint of physical and mental energies, and they've put that in the entirety of their life. And in their mind, or at the very least their thought, I think, is that there's this kind of agreement of sorts that if I contribute and put my energies in regards to the society on some level, at some basic level, society will also deal with that also, meaning give us back what we give. Even if it's not perfect, even if it's not great, even if in some cases it was unfair in the way that it was partitioned, there was still a wisp of a thought that was true. And now you have a crisis of sorts. And, even if people can make the argument that certain people can go back to school or work, it is to some degree somewhat of a crisis. And it just seems like our ability to deal with it was just not there. Like, if we wanted to blow something up across the world, we could do it. We could press a button, it'll happen. If we wanted to knock a satellite out the sky, we could do it. If we wanted to invest technology to put a man on Mars, we could do it. But for the very basics of dealing with just a pandemic, something that happens routinely, it seemed that we were socially not prepared for it, politically not prepared for it, economically not prepared for it. Like, across the board, it seems like we have failed. And I think the question that we really need to ask ourselves is A, why? And B, how do we not fail when this inevitably happens again? That's the question I'm going to go with you, Shane. How do we prevent this from happening again? Yeah, it is. Because we can't do anything about it currently.
Looking at this. Totally. Yeah. So are you familiar with this guy, Eric Weinstein? Does that name sound at all familiar?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
yes. So he's like one of the key members of this thing. It's like a kind of a right-wing community, but he bills himself as left-wing. Anyway, his brother got more popular. Brett Weinstein, center of like this Evergreen State College thing. Eric Weinstein's mathematician. Also, a check, I suppose, against him, but he's like the managing director of Thiel Capital. So Peter Thiel has like multiple private investment firms. Eric Weinstein is the managing director, but he's also like a mathematician and a kind of like a media person. Anyway, I watch some of his videos sometimes. I kind of like him as a voice. One of the things he talks about sometimes is the idea that we're in this long nap, where from like 1945 up until sometime in modernity, sometime like now, call it, we've been in this sort of long nap, like geopolitically, in terms of our culture, in terms of the things that we care about, where we've sort of assumed that things would just sort of grow and work themselves out, almost without any effort on our part, just mechanically. And we, you and I talk sometimes about the government and how the government, if it's not held accountable, if it doesn't have this sort of feedback loop with either other players or with the best interest of its own people, its own citizens, its own constituents, if it's not focusing on those things and sort of rewarded for improving its relationships with those entities, then it's just going to decline and degrade. I think that's part of what's happened here. And you're talking about the decline of the social contract, our inability to get out the stimulus bill. If we've been in this long nap for a long time, that's subtly been like growing into a long nightmare, where we're increasingly feeling levels of unease, I think that's sort of what we're seeing, then something like this is a wake-up call. In that metaphor, something like the coronavirus or a pandemic like we're seeing now. You could also look at an early wake-up call would have been the two towers coming down, just for America alone. That was a huge cultural moment that sort of broke the stasis. Another moment would be 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, and 2016 with Trump, arguably Brexit too. The Scottish referendum. There are these sort of different events in the Western world that you can see as major departures. I think the coronavirus, because of its worldwide impact, is going to be that wake-up call. I don't see how it can't. Just because of how deeply it's affected everything. The other side of that, though, the converse, is that we're all stuck at home. So what kind of a wake-up call where you're woken up and then you're forced to be stuck at home, isolating from other people, kind of generally afraid about the course of society, not able to get back to work, not able to get to work in the first place. I mean, we were talking about the stimulus bill, inability to pass it. What is it? 40% of Americans, 40 million Americans, and 40% of households, up to 43% of renter households facing eviction this year. That's huge. We're still having protests over the Black Lives Matter issue, George Floyd killing. 80% of those facing eviction would be people of color, particularly Black and Latino Americans. So there's this cluster of issues that Congress could foresee if it had any gosh darn sense about it. But for whatever reason, they're still stuck in the nap. And I think that in a weird way, one way to view it is...
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just in closing, there's this like exciting opportunity to like wake up and sort of take the reins, take charge again of your political institutions, of your media institutions, to try to like gain power in this new circumstance. Because frankly, the old caretakers, the old stewards, aren't stewarding it. They're asleep. they're not making decisions, especially not ones that are helping anybody. Anyway, Jamarl, we've got callers too. But what's your take?
We do have callers. I'll keep it to like 30 seconds. I do think we're in a sleep. I mean, we're asleep, meaning as a population per se. I don't think that's necessarily Congress. I think that's the population. And I think we've gotten so accustomed to our jobs and to our things that we just kind of use that we call life and reality that we miss real things. The coronavirus is a real thing. It's something that's interceding upon your contrived existence, meaning the dramas of our life that we partake in and we engage in. Those things aren't entirely real, even though they kind of exist on your mental plane. This is real, and this is something that exists on your physical plane that is directly interacting with your physical body in a way that is deleterious to health. And so I do think this is a wake-up call. The question is, do we actually wake up from it? That's the question. Well, we have callers, so let's go to some of the callers. We have, for the first one, Robert in D.C. Robert, what's going on?
What's going on, guys? Loyal listener. But you guys are losing your art of the double talk. How you turn your partner into a Trump supporter? A never Trump.
What do you mean? What do you mean? Oh, because he was defending Trump.
Oh, wow. But on the back end, how could he did more when he was fighting the impeachment back in February? We can't forget about the garbage that was going on there. You know, I'm not a Trump supporter either. You know, I'm a Biden guy. But, you know, he was dealing with the garbage. He couldn't, he could probably have done both. But your opinion on that is, you know, a little bit outrageous.
You think my opinion on that is outrageous? Donald Trump, you're trying to argue that basically the impeachment stopped Donald Trump from doing what was necessary for his job as president. I don't buy that in the least. Donald Trump had all sorts of warning from the World Health Organization. Donald Trump had a mole in the World Health Organization while he kept attacking it for saying it was being too Chinese or too China-oriented. Come on. Are you really making the argument to me that the reason that Donald Trump didn't do more, that he didn't use the Defense Production Act to make equipment, that he didn't marshal the forces of the U.S. government in order to ensure that people had the masks and supplies that they needed, that he didn't organize himself? You're telling me that had everything to do with impeachment and nothing to do with just incompetence from the standpoint of Trump.
The impeachment was a major deal. That's not a little thing that we're talking about that went on. It's not.
True.
You're losing the art of the double talk. You then lost the discussion already.
Impeachment was not the thing that stopped Donald Trump from doing his job. Donald Trump was just more focused on economic concerns. That's everything. I mean, you can look at even the checks. When those checks initially first came out, if you remember, the Democrats were against them. Donald Trump was pushing for them. Now, modest, but it was something that he was pushing for in order to try to deal with it. I'm making the point that the fact that he could push for those checks got across that he had some agency and ability to deal with those items. Also, when did impeachment actually end?
An American, you know. I fell out of that loop because a year ago I was unemployed and I got me a decent job, you understand? And I'm on the clock now. I'm you know, everything is everything with me. But I thought homeless guys on the street, if you had a birth certificate and a Social Security card, you was going to get you a $1,200 check. That ain't the case at all. That's not the case. It wasn't the case, and it won't be the case. So, you know, you're losing. You're losing the argument.
We're losing the art of the double talk. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. We're losing the art of the double talk. Let's go to David in Texas. David, what's going on?
Yeah. Good morning. Excuse me. I got to take on Sheriff Bart. You know, the black sheriff from this comedic western back in the 70s, Blazing Saddles. You know, there's one part in the movie where he's surrounded by the rednecks and he's got a pistol to his head talking about do what he say. Well, when he's talking about that, I understand totally where he's coming from. He's talking about the spirit. And I'm telling you, the spirit's got a message for the fat boys over there in Washington, D.C. I'm talking about Trump and Pompous. The people of Syria have suffered enough. That maximum pressure needs to ease up, and let's start making some friends instead of making enemies. That's all I got.
Very cool. Thank you, David.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I like that. So let's take a break. We will be back in a moment with Leith Marouf. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red.
Hello,
Leith.
Yeah.
Hello, Leith. We got you scheduled for the interview in a couple minutes here.
Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And this segment and the next, Leith Marouf. He is an award-winning multimedia producer and media policy / law consultant, focusing on issues of liberalization and decolonization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples. You can, for just a quick note, you can follow Leith on Twitter at Leith Marouf. That's LaithMarouf. Leith, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, doing as good as possible after such a tragic event. We're just waiting for more information right now.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And that's exactly what we brought you on to talk about. So just real quick, where are you in the world right now?
I am in Beirut. We've been here on contract. Usually I reside in Montreal in Canada. And that's where my work is at the Community Media Advocacy Center. But we've been in Beirut for a year on contract, and then COVID, Corona hit, and we were stuck here. And then this tragic event happened 3 days ago now.
Yeah, so exactly. That's what we're talking about. 3 days ago, the world was shocked by it. Very quickly, videos were coming out, pretty catastrophic-looking videos of this massive explosion, fire at, from what I've heard, a firecracker warehouse that apparently had ammonium nitrate inside of it that accelerated the explosion dramatically. That's the sort of official set of events. But I've heard the official narrative again: up to 300,000 homeless in Beirut due to this attack or due to this catastrophe, and potentially upwards of $3 billion worth of damages. So big hits on either side. About a week and a half of national emergency in a state of emergency in the city of Beirut over the next week and a half. That's the sort of set of facts that I've heard about from the outside. Also, this issue of the Russian boat. But what is it? We can get into your personal experience there in the city in a second. But what else am I missing? What are the swirling events in the city that you've heard about? Facts on the ground there that we might not have heard about in the States.
So there was supposedly a shipment of 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate that were confiscated in 2014 from a ship that supposedly was going from Georgia to Africa to unload its shipment, but somehow had some trouble and ended up being dragged to the Beirut port, where the owners of the ship abandoned the shipment, and it was unloaded into the port because the ship sank. Now, these are just some of the main lines. We don't know really, was the shipment actually destined for Africa? Was the ship purposefully sabotaged so it will dock in Beirut? And was actually 2,750 metric tons of ammonium nitrate still in the port when this explosion happened, or were most of it already smuggled, and this is what we're hearing, that there was at least only maximum 800 tons left of this 2,750 tons. Most of it had either been smuggled to their destination, which seems to be Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Remember, it was the height of the war against Syria, and these Wahhabi death squads, these mercenaries, were able to reach the mountains in Lebanon and occupy some of the country before eventually Hezbollah and the Syrian and Lebanese army liberated those areas. So there's some indications that the intended, people that were supposed to get this shipment of ammonium nitrate were these death squads. And so the question comes right now is, why hasn't this shipment been destroyed the minute it was confiscated? And who knew about that the shipment was still part of it in the port? And how, so right now we have around 16 officials from the Port Authority that have been arrested. That also includes members of the intelligence force that are responsible for the protection of the port, and all their finances frozen upon the investigation. The president just spoke an hour ago, less than an hour ago. President Aoun, in a statement, said that there is a possibility of foreign interference in the explosion that happened. He also indicated that he spoke yesterday to President of France, Emmanuel Macron, who was here in Beirut, and asked him directly for aerial and satellite footage of the port of Beirut before, during, and after the explosion to investigate that possibility, and that he told Macron that if France doesn't hand over that footage, that he will be asking other foreign powers that have that capability to aid Lebanon in studying the possibility of foreign interference.
That's fascinating, because when this first came out, Donald Trump made a statement, an offhand statement about an attack, basically saying that there was some kind of attack. We do know that there was conflict between Israel and Lebanon leading up to this particular point, and it does seem like Israel has come out with a statement showing some kind of support after the fact. Is that the reason why Lebanon is looking at this as a foreign, or potentially a foreign assault? I mean, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a missile for it to be some kind of attack. Is that where the president is going in, and have they given any additional information in regards to that area of the investigation?
We have a deadline for the investigation to come up with a full explanation by Sunday. But one thing that is important to note is that the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, will be speaking tonight in exactly 2 hours to the nation, and everybody's expecting him to address these issues. There's many consequences and also, events that led up to this explosion that have to be kept in mind when we're analyzing. One of them is obviously the fact that Israel martyred one of the Hezbollah cadres in Syria around 3 weeks ago. And at the time, Hezbollah said that they will be responding, because that's the formula of engagement that has been set between Hezbollah and Israel, that an eye for an eye. And at the time, Hezbollah, the Israeli government sent messages to Hezbollah practically apologizing and saying that they didn't know that a Hezbollah cadre was there in Damascus, in the location that they bombed. And upon that, the whole of the Israeli army was put on high alert. They withdrew around 8 kilometers from the border from Lebanon and hid all their positions. And all of Israel has been standing on one foot, waiting for their punishment for 2 weeks. And at the time, before this explosion in Beirut, the Israeli media was and the officials were going crazy. They were not happy at the optics of, looking like they are weak and waiting for their punishment. Also, within that period, the Minister of Defense of Israel threatened to destroy the infrastructure of Lebanon. And also, we have to go back to 2006, and after the war in Lebanon, when Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, said clearly that if any time in the future that Israel attacks Lebanese infrastructure, that they will retaliate with the same. And he also reminded the Israelis of the big nitrate tanks that they have in Haifa port, and that the fact that if those tanks of nitrate are attacked, it will wipe out Haifa. And so, given all these indications of, and seeing that the action was also an explosion of nitrate in the port of Beirut, it definitely feels like that Israel was not happy with this optics of being forced to look like weak and waiting for their punishment, standing on one leg, and decided to actually attack the port of Beirut and bring all of Lebanon down to its knees before any punishment comes. So optically, this is how it looks. We're waiting for the speech of Hassan Nasrallah tonight, which he's the most trusted political person in all of the region. The Israeli media stands for every word that he speaks and believes him before they even believe any Israeli officials. So tonight we may find out if actually there is foreign interference, and if there is, then we should all expect that Hezbollah will retaliate in measured response of the same, and we don't know what that will open up to.
Yeah, that's what's ultimately, if you're right about that situation, if you're right about the potentially proportionate response, that would be potentially catastrophic. That could pull a lot of other parties into that dispute very quickly. Two questions. Maybe we can come back to that. We're only a few minutes away from our first break here. And we'll be back with you on the other side of that. But before we go into that, a couple of quick questions. One, do you know where the ammonium nitrate was stored? Was it in the same warehouse? And then two, second question, over the past month and a half, I'd say, it's been a little over a week since I've looked into this, but there were a string of fires, kind of mysterious fires taking place across Iran, including in ports, a nuclear facility there, I believe, just a smattering of different places that also seemed a little bit suspicious. There were a bunch of people wondering if this was subversive activity. A lot of people were assuming that there was subversive activity by either Israel, the United States, or some other intelligence agency or party. Would you connect that to this event? Do you see any connection there? So again, one, a question about the ammonium nitrate and warehouse, where it was located specifically, and then two, about Iran and potential connections there.
Well, there was supposedly a warehouse hosting fireworks in the port, and adjacent to it is this warehouse that supposedly the 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate were housed in. They were not in the same warehouse. So if you notice, if you go back and look at the footage, you'll see initially one warehouse that's burning, and then the warehouse beside it, which was adjacent to the silos where all the wheat reserve of Lebanon sat, was where the ammonium nitrate. Luckily, because of the silos, actually a big part of the city was saved from the shockwave, and because of the fact that it was right on the open sea. If this was not in the open sea and the silos were not there, there would have been hundreds more martyred and thousands even more injured and much more damage to the city, which is already a huge disaster. In terms of what was happening in Iran, we saw that string of attacks, and eventually the Iranian government, the special forces, the military, they all indicated that the attack on Nanan's nuclear reactor was actually an act of sabotage, that it wasn't, there was no military munitions used in terms of no rockets, no drones, no planes, and there was no cyber attack because the reactor compound is insulated from the internet, that it is not connected. So there was an actual physical infiltration into the site and a somehow instigation of the explosion that happened. So given that fact, and we can probably presume that if there was an attack on Beirut, it will follow that same pattern, that it may have been an actual on-the-ground infiltration, not using any rockets or missiles, but that's also still open for discussion. This is why we heard the president of Lebanon just now asking for the satellite and aerial images that are in the possession of the French military.
You guys are listening to Leith Marouf, award-winning multimedia producer and media policy law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonialization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples and building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined for this segment by Leith Marouf. We'll get it back into it with him in just a second. I actually wanted to clear something up. We had a caller, I believe it was John from Baton Rouge, who called during the 7 o'clock hour, who was talking about our coverage of this. He said something about how we had used the wrong term. We had called it ammonium sulfide. I thought we had called it ammonium nitrate the whole way along. I went back and checked the headlines from a few days ago. We called it that then. But Jamarl came in. Apparently, in our headlines yesterday, we had it as ammonium sulfide. I'm sorry. You were right. We were wrong. We were misreporting that. I think I'm for the most part, I do the headlines most mornings. I think I had just copied that in from a media source that got that wrong. And if so, that's still my fault. But either way, just letting you know, Jamarl was giving me the good faith interpretation where he thought it might have been the media mess up.
Well, I assume it's a media mess up. I don't believe for one moment you'd have wrote ammonium sulfide under normal circumstances if that wasn't put somewhere where they were calling it that. I also remember it being called ammonium nitrate. So, look, this is one of those things where as a story evolves and people are putting out information on the story, the information evolves. In which case, we have Leith Marouf on to talk about it right now. So definitely to clarify and nail down what was taking place and what's the belief so far. That's been going on. Leith, I'm curious, what is the political situation in Lebanon right now, specifically going on with what just took place in Beirut? How's the public dealing with this, and how's the political class dealing with this?
Definitely the public is still in shock. A lot of people have come down to the streets trying to do the cleanup. Although where I live is around 5 kilometers, 5 kilometers, which is I think like 3 miles away from the epicenter of the explosion. A lot of the apartments around us lost their windows, and a lot of the storefronts also got their storefronts blown up. So it's been now 3 days of constant people just cleaning out glass. I took a walk yesterday to the supermarket, this 6 blocks away. Every dumpster is packed with and overflowing with broken glass. and the cleanup is still happening, mostly by the residents helping each other, volunteers coming in, the scouts, and such. So that's where the people are concentrating right now, because there's a lot of missing. Some of them are being picked up from the sea, as happened this morning. A person was survived after 30 hours in the sea, was picked up. So there's a lot of that where what's on the minds of the people. But then, in the political class, we see obviously those who are belonging to the imperialist positions that are tools of the empire, trying to, at the beginning, after the explosion, immediately try to blame it on Hezbollah. We heard false news about Hezbollah having a warehouse of munition in the port. Luckily, last year, around this exact time, is the commemorations of the 2006 war on Lebanon, the Israeli war on Lebanon. Nasrallah, in a speech at that time, when Israel, Netanyahu, Prime Minister, came out to the media with pictures of the port, claiming that there's munition for Hezbollah in the port of Beirut, denied it and opened the doors and said Hezbollah doesn't use the port in Beirut. So that story died out very fast because it was fake news and was trying to kind of mobilize people against Hezbollah. We can see right now, obviously, the government, very weakened because it does have nothing now to help the people. Already, the economy has been destroyed with the sanctions. Lebanon has only borders to Syria or Israel. Those two borders are closed. Its only way out was the port, and now the port is gone. The economy has collapsed fully now. There is no more work. So the government of Lebanon has to scramble to solve not only the problems that were there before the explosion, but deal with it in this drastic moment. And thankfully, a lot of governments, including Syria, Iraq, Iran, China, and Russia, have all broken the American sanctions and have sent tens of planes loads of aid, food, and medical aid. And even Iraq started a caravan of oil tankers that are passing through Syria to Lebanon to bring gasoline and diesel that will serve the economy, where now, there has been shortages since obviously the explosion.
So, two quick follow-ups here, actually, Leith. One, what are the effects on the food supply? You said that the grain silos next to the building there sort of shielded the blast, but I'm guessing that they were taken too. I'm guessing those were hit pretty hard. What do you think the effects of this are going to be on the food supply in Beirut, the prices there? I know protests have been going on for a while now. It seems like they're kind of kicking back into the action here after this. Let's just go with that for now. What do you think the result is going to be with the food supply, Leith?
So the majority of the wheat reserve of the country was in those silos, and they've been blown up. Anything that's left in the silos is contaminated. So right now, the country has only a month and a half reserve of wheat left. And so part of what the emergency response from the government happened the night of was to nationalize basically the wheat supply that is there and take control of it, whatever is left of this wheat, and only distribute it to bakeries so nobody can export it or try to gouge the prices. So on that front, we have some safety. Syria, which is already having problems with this wheat supply that is being stolen by the American occupation forces and the Kurdish Contras, the death squads that work with them in northeast Syria, also offered some wheat. And Iraq just sent in also trucks of wheat coming to the country. So one of the silver linings of this explosion is that everybody is breaching the ridiculous, illegal, inhuman sanctions that the United States put on Lebanon and Syria to try to save the population, and hopefully this will become the norm.
Let me ask you this: the condition with the United States, they are not stealing it; they're burning it. If I remember this correctly, the U.S., in addition to stealing the oil in Syria, also took a policy of basically destroying the wheat crop in Syria, making it basically trying to push them in food insecurity as a way of putting more pressure on Syria. The fact that Syria, even within its own food insecurity, is still trying to help and send is, that's in and of itself an amazing thing and a show of solidarity among many of the nations. I'm curious about Macron. Now, when Macron worked with the United States in order, the U.S., Britain, and the U.S. And France, in order to destroy Libya, one of the things kept coming up was Macron getting real angry and annoyed with people pointing out that they were selling slaves in Libya as a result of your actions, and Macron not necessarily wanting to take credit for the end goal of that effect, meaning the consequence of his actions in trying to destroy that country or undermining that country. He has been getting a lot of talk, or a lot of talk has been going or circulating around Macron dealing with Libya. Can you explain why Macron, such conversation is being brought up about France and Macron, and what's the history of this in order to give context to why Macron is factoring in this conversation at all?
So just to note, in terms of Syria, yes, the United States and the Kurdish Contras were burning some of the fields, but a lot of the farmers managed to collect their crop. The Syrian government has these collection points, these silos all across the northeast of Syria, where the majority of the wheat is grown. And the farmers breached the blockade that the Kurdish Contras were doing and delivered that wheat. But eventually, the Americans landed with 3 helicopters full of their forces on top of the wheat silos in Hasaka and occupied them by force. And then eventually loaded that wheat in the silos on trucks. And with the Kurdish Contras, who are supposed to be enemies of Turkey, drove those trucks to Turkey and sold them to Turkey. And a lot of the residents in the area revolted, started attacking the wheat trucks that the Kurds were trying to sell to Turkey. And for the last 3 days, there has been an uprising in the villages on the Euphrates River that are under Kurdish control. Not a lot of people are hearing about it because of the news of the explosion in Beirut overtaking that story. But there's a literal armed uprising right now in the northeast of Syria. And the Americans have sent a humongous convoy of American troops and weapons through Iraq this morning. So we don't know where that situation is going. Of course, all of these things are related to each other. What's happening in Lebanon is related to what's happening in Syria. And in terms of Macron, the Western powers are furious at any, not only Arab, but any person in the world that tries to liberate their nation and create a sovereign state that is not under the control of Western imperialism. And, no matter what the faults were of Gaddafi, Gaddafi was responsible for the liberation of South Africa. He was responsible for the liberation of Ireland. And we remember Mandela making his first visit after being liberated from South Africa to Libya and thanking it for all its efforts. So even though Gaddafi gave up his weapons after seeing what the Americans did to Saddam Hussein in 2003 and started investing in the West, what was the result of him giving up his weapons is that they made him pay for his belief that Africa, Asia, South America should be free of white supremacy and imperialism. And unfortunately, this is what's happening to all these republics like Yemen and Syria and Libya, who managed to liberate themselves from Western colonialism after World War II. And
Leith, I'm afraid to say we've got to cut it here. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. You've been listening to the voice of Leith Marouf, award-winning multimedia producer and media policy and law consultant. You can follow Leith on Twitter at LaithMarouf. Also check out his website, CMA Center. That's center spelled CENTRE.org. We'll be back in a minute. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour of our show this week. The most disruptive show in American politics, in global politics. Hopefully we won't split the world up. Fault Lines, after all. In the politically independent corner, I am investigative radio show host and political analyst. Let's just use that, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host Shane Stranahan. And I know that sounds weird if it says the last man, but that's okay. I'm going with it. Lone Ranger stuff. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Oh, man, that's great. Together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get into top headlines now. I'll come back. There's something I wanted to talk about, but we can talk about it after the headlines. First headline. This is a new one for me. Democratic Socialist of America activist Marquita Bradshaw won a shocking victory in the Democratic Senate primary in Tennessee on Thursday. She beat the Senate Democrats' preferred candidate, James Mackler, there in a 5-way nominating contest. Aside from not being the party's preferred candidate, she also had to deal with a monetary disparity, campaign income and expenditure disparity, with Bradshaw raising only $8,420 in the first quarter of the year. So Democratic Senate primary victory with only under $9,000 in funding in the first quarter of the year. That's pretty matched. We were talking the other day about sort of insurgency coming from people who can compete by online messaging and sort of grassroots messaging without having to raise hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars worth of funds in state races. This is one of those examples. That was just the first quarter. I'm curious to see what the second quarter.
Oh, she didn't even foul. It wasn't so much it was so little. She didn't even foul for the second quarter.
That's great. Okay, all right. That's the first headline. Second headline, stimulus talks are reportedly on the brink of collapse. This comes despite weeks of negotiations and a pitched 3-hour meeting yesterday between administration officials and Democratic Party leaders, namely Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. The administration says it will take executive action. There will be an executive order today, Friday, if Congress doesn't pass a bill. On the subject of executive orders, Trump has signed a few prohibiting, specifically a big one, prohibiting U.S. residents from doing business with TikTok and WeChat beginning 45 days from now. One big thing I'm going to note here, Microsoft has been in talks with TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, about potentially buying TikTok as soon as September 15th. So that would be within the 45-day window. Not sure how that would affect, U.S. residents. I'm not sure how that would apply to U.S. corporations, but certainly optically, from my naive perspective, that's within the window. There's this tight period, it seems, where Trump is definitively wanting to push away from China. It seems before he gets elected. I'm just worried this is building up to an armed conflict. I'm legitimately worried that the trade war, which has been back and forth for years now, kind of seemed to have gone into a bit of a stasis, a hiatus at least for a little while there. Certainly accelerated again this year. I'm worried about the prospects of that turning into a world war, or at least some kind of limited regional conflict. In our next story, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine. Quick follow on to that last headline there. Separately, China reassured the world basically that it is not the Soviet Union and it has no intention of becoming another United States. So clearly distancing themselves from the Cold War dichotomy there, distancing themselves both from the Soviet Union and, of course, from the United States. That second one seems particularly notable because the United States does the whole policeman of the world thing, and China's basically saying they're not going to follow in that line. Next story, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine tested positive for coronavirus yesterday and then tested negative. This initial announcement came shortly before a planned meeting between Governor DeWine and President Trump. That would have, if he had passed that along, that would have been huge news. On that note, the U.S. has topped 2,000 coronavirus deaths in a 24-hour period for the first time in 3 months. I remember where for day after day after day after day, it was somewhere in the 2,000s. People, over 2,000 people were dying a day. That was not good. And it seems like we're showing signs of being back there pretty soon. In our next story, New York's Attorney General Letitia James is going after the NRA on grounds of years of runaway corruption and misspending. So is District of Columbia's DC's Attorney General Carl A. Racine accusing the NRA of, quote, allowing charitable funds to be used for non-charitable purposes, failing to operate independently, and placing the NRA's interests ahead of its own charitable purposes, end quote. In our next story, California's Alameda County is giving everyone who tests positive with coronavirus and needs to stay home a stipend of $1,250. The county has set aside $10 million to cover this, which would be enough to cover about 7,500 stipends. That's the number. In our next story, according to Bloomberg, America will have fallen 25 slots in the Economic Misery Index, which combines measures of unemployment and inflation. America has dropped from its position at number 25 on this list to number 50. There are only 60 countries on that list, by the way. So again, just put it like this. We were number 25 out of 60, which is not a great spot for, the unipolar power in the world. And then we dropped to number 50 out of 60. That's not a good look, man. I know that looks aren't everything, but that's not a good look, man. In the next story, the United States has lifted its a harsh prohibition. This was just a recommendation, but it was the strictest recommendation the U.S. could give. You shouldn't travel overseas. That's been rolled back, and now it's based more on regional levels of virality, how different countries have responded, how many cases you can expect to get there. Also, some degree of political alliance. France and Germany, for instance, are given a lower level rating. They're given, as sort of France, Germany, the United Kingdom, given a lower rating than other countries in the region that are a little bit more distant from the U.S. In our next story on Wednesday, a couple days ago, the Virginia Department of Health launched COVIDwise, an app that uses Apple and Google's COVID-19 contact tracing technology. They are the first state to have launched an app based on Apple and Google's API, by the way. In our next story, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman apparently sent a hit squad to attack and kill a former spy, Saad al-Jabri, in Canada. This came 13 days, according to al-Jabri, after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. The name of this hit squad, by the way, is the Tiger Squad. We live in a weird world. The Tiger Squad doesn't. I don't know, man. It doesn't sound like that's. I don't want to get hit, but that doesn't sound like as official or like vicious a name as I would have expected Saudi Arabia or Mohammed bin Salman himself to hire. I don't know. Tiger Squad. Anyway, in our next story, Twitter says it has added labels to state-backed accounts and state-backed media-funded accounts, but they have not added this to fault lines. I checked when I saw this headline yesterday. Fault lines is still unlabeled, undistinguished, and I'm sad about that, frankly. But yeah, I'm guessing at some point they'll come around. In my last story today, 4 victims of terminal cancer in Canada can now legally take magic mushrooms before they die. I would say that's a big step, but in its own way, it's also like a human interest story. I don't know. We'll see. There's so much privacy that I think these people deserve, but I'm also curious if there are stories of people late in life, either terminally ill or just who are expecting to pass at some point in the near future, who take these magic mushrooms. And if you sort of do a before and after sort of interviews with them, I don't know. That sounds a little bit manipulative, but I could just see that being beautiful. Anyway, those are the headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, and we're taking calls. Quick note, we're taking calls 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, we're going to get into stories in a second. I just wanted to quickly note, this is, again, I don't mean to make this too much about myself. I'm still trying to figure out how to bill myself on the radio show.
What do you mean?
So I was just calling myself a radio show host there. I was being pretty bland about it, especially because you were saying this other stuff that was pretty cool. And then I was just calling myself a radio show host in our intro. And now I don't know exactly where to go. I've added the political analyst thing back in yet. In any event, I was about to say regardless, but
I think the problem is that mine is so over the top that it almost forces somebody like you to respond almost in kind in order to balance it. And it almost creates like a deficit just because of what mine is, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think the problem, like if I just came out and says, on the left, I'm political analyst Jamarl Thomas, I think there would be no issue. I think it's
but I think it's pretty cool. I mean,
it might be cool, but it still creates it's almost like, by definition of how I do it, it forces you to do something in kind and to create parity. And
exactly. And so I was
right.
doing the bland thing. I've like been doing the inverted thing where I like don't say anything about myself, and it's just like I'm there's the least information you could possibly have about me. Literally, I'm hosting a radio show, which by definition, if you're listening to this show, you know to be true. But so I was doing that for a little while, and I admit that was kind of passive aggressive. And now I'm just thinking maybe I should get like imaginative or something. I don't know. Maybe I should actually just nail down a description and stick with it. But I've been coming up with them on an almost daily basis and throwing them in there. Anyway,
it's up to
you.
There's no right or wrong. Nothing. Yeah, but there's no right or wrong. I mean, it just seems that way just because of the relative distance between the two items. And look, you can even make an argument that showing the disparity between the two, my natural, overly over verbosity, is a fault lines with your not being that way. Like, you can even make the argument that the fault lines in and of itself is being experientially displayed just in the way that topics are being gone. So yeah,
it's true. Yeah, no, we're pitching ourselves in the opposite ways. I hear you. I don't know what to do, man. Anyway, I feel like I've made myself the center of too much attention, and that's just outside my nature. So let's.
You're the
talk
host
about
of a radio show. You're gonna be part of this
embarrassing. I know.
One of the interesting things I'm looking forward to is the Trump executive order. You have no idea how excited I am about the prospect of that. I mean, is it just me? Like, because if Trump can do this, if Trump can come out and say, I'm going to pass an executive order to deal with evictions, and I'm going to pass an executive order to ensure that people continue to get unemployment insurance. That is mind-blowing. And what does that mean for poverty just in and of itself in regards to what a president accepts, or for medical bills that a president accepts? That would mean that the president could basically get rid of poverty by himself with executive order if Trump can come out and make this order. I'm enamored by this. I am so curious on the legal framework that he's going to use in order to make this work. But we may see it. We may, if it hits to the end of Friday, Trump has painted himself in a corner where he's almost stuck doing it. Because how can you say, I'm going to pass an executive order if Democrats don't do this? The Democrats say, okay, go ahead. Let's see it. I'm so curious about this. You think he's going to do it? Or you think it's going to be underwhelming?
It's going to be both. If he does it, some people are going to say it's underwhelming. But the other side of this is that Democrats haven't been doing it. And so if he does it, it'll put some egg on their face. And I don't think they want that. So if he does it, they'll try to downplay it and they'll, accuse him of not including some very important provisions they wanted included. I think that's how that's going to go. But regardless, if he does it first, that'll still probably look bad optically. So we might see some progress from Congress today on this. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. I think it would look horrible if Donald Trump comes out and do this in a way the Democrats are just kind of standing there looking crazy. I mean, basically, the president of the United States is going to make two arguments. He's going to say they didn't do their jobs. And he's going to specifically say Democrats didn't do their jobs. And because Democrats didn't do their jobs, I, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, who cares about each and every person, including every black baby that's ever born, am now going to impart X or Y. And the public is going to give him credit for that. Like, that's the point, right? I think for Donald Trump's thing, this is a win-win. He makes Congress or Democrats look like they're just, weak and facile as they stand there, not really doing the job. And even potentially, politically, trying to make the country worse off in order to make Trump look bad. But also, it looks like a president that's taking command and being presidential and trying to ensure the welfare of the community. I think it's a win-win for Donald Trump. I think it's a lose-lose for Democrats if they don't find some way to get involved in regards to this process. And the thing is, Republicans have something to do with this too, right? It's not just the Democrats by itself, even though Trump is going to accuse Democrats of it. Democrats want $3 trillion. Trump wants $1 trillion. Republicans want $1 trillion. Trump, at this point, I don't think cares. I think he just wants something so he doesn't get hit and stuck with the notion that the country basically slid off the edge and he uniquely was responsible. So no, I think he does want to do something. I think he would take executive action if he had the opportunity to do so. And I do think it looks good for him to take executive action. Whether or not he has the power to do it or not, that's almost irrelevant. The American public seeing him doing it is the thing that is beneficial to Trump and his election chances, frankly.
I think he should sign this executive order. I think he should include 4 things in it. 1, not $600 a week, but $1,200 a week to every American. 2, he should open up the JFK files and the Abraham Lincoln files and the Warren G. Harding files. You weren't expecting that, folks. Number 3, he should disclose all alien landings. And then number 4, he should prepare us for the fact that we're living in a simulation, which I think he's already doing sort of tacitly, just by all the weird stuff he's been doing. Anyway, that's fake news. He shouldn't actually do pretty much all that stuff, at least the last 3, I'd say even the first one. But we're going to go into a break. We'll be back in a minute. We're taking calls, by the way. 202-521-1320. Jamarl, you can't respond to what I just said, at least until the other side of the break. We'll be back in a minute. Fault Lines, Thomas Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. You can call in fact, you should, 202-521-1320.
Yeah.
So
let's have a revelation segment for a moment.
Yeah, go for it.
I want to respond to the comment. I think Trump should do all of those things. Every last one of those things. Now, he should also add in evictions, and he should also add in, like you said, the extra income. Look, the simulation thing is fascinating to me because I think if we are really looking for a technological solution to get out of our human issue, meaning our ability to interact with one another, our ability to not continuously to see each other as an enemy, to work cooperatively, as opposed to having things within our system that incentivize us to work in competitive odds with one another. One way to do that would be through technology and through a simulation. Now, if I could go through, let's say when I went to school, instead of going to school for school books and classrooms and everything else, I sat in the chair and I was basically put into a simulation where I am born, I grow up, live, and die. And I do this over the course of the day, maybe multiple times, with different lifetimes and different experiences. So in one experience, I may be, African American, another one I may be Asian, another one I may be Hispanic, another one I may be gay, another one I may be whatever. And it goes across the board. And at the end of your schooling, let's say by the time you reach the age of 10, you'd have lived through 100,000 lives. And maybe there's some way of measuring cognitive capabilities or your ability to get along and those type of things in order to figure out whether or not you would be appropriate in that new society of evolved human beings that no longer see themselves or see the other person as the enemy. Now, what do you think about that as a way of getting rid of many of our, let's say, human issues that have developed over time, especially with this issue of competitiveness and seeing people as the other? With that technological fix of putting you and thousands of lives across all these different demographics, poor, rich, all of those things, in order for you to get a well-rounding understanding of what it means to be a person, to live in a more evolved society. Are you for or against that, Shane? Are you going to be one of those people who put their kids up for that level of technology and learning?
Well, see here, I thought you were going to be asking if we were currently in that, which is from the simulation, perspective of the argument. You could totally be making that case that we're currently, you and I are just sort of people who are sampled from the whole full spectrum of everybody that exists, and we're living that out. It's interesting whether or not, we should do that proactively, that question. My argument is probably no, just because.
Really? You're going to say no? Now, why? Why is that a no? I'm giving you a pathway for evolved humanity, and you're telling me no, Shane. You don't want people screwing around in our kids' heads. What's the reason?
Here's the thing. You know what I mean? It's this is where I think there's a kind of a slippery slope argument, but it's not even that. It's there needs to be another version of this argument. We don't know how steep any slope is on this one, where as soon as you start abstracting from humanity, as soon as you, and man, there's so too much of a conversation. We could have a 12-hour straight podcast conversation where we just roam over these topics. So let's not do that. But if you're looking, like, if you detach people from their humanity, if you say to somebody, okay, you are no longer your specific identity, or even given a person, but you're some subset of people, or further from that, you're some subset of all possible consciousness, and that's those are the terms of engagement that you're going to bring to your life and interact with the universe, from within that sort of. If you view yourself almost as a statistical instance of any of a number of possible realities or whatever, I don't think that actually works. I think that there's that's sort of logical framework that we apply, and I think in a weird way that's, I don't know, I'm abstract and philosophical. I think that's what you're doing there. I think that this is inevitably what you get into when you start quote unquote tampering on a deeper level with not just some of the biological margins of what it means to be a human being, but with like the very core of human experience and expressivity and stuff. So if you and this other question of creating life, say you did this, say you spun up in a simulation the perspectives of different people in society, and you fiddled with the equation until you thought that it had some consciousness, and each person in that little simulation was conscious. That's ethically jumping the shark, and I don't know what happens on the other side of that. We haven't gone over that. Singularity is just something you don't know what's on the other side. That's one way of looking at it. Something you're absolutely uncertain about. That's a singularity. I don't know what the hell is on the other side of that decision, and therefore I'm kind of categorically rejecting it, at least for now, at least until we figure some more things out. Thankfully, I don't think we actually have to make this decision.
I can't disagree with you more on this.
Go for it.
Consider for the moment a society that has lived our existence, what we consider to be our life. Now, I would say in 1,000 years, what we are living now would be considered dystopian if we are still around. And that society hit its head on a problem that ultimately, regardless of what we've experienced and lived through, it is impossible to impart it to our kids. Meaning, even if we have come on the other side of, let's say, a Third World War, and we have come on this other side of all of this consternation and all of these people fighting over wealth and a small number of people making decisions for a larger part of the population that is in their own considerable interests. Well, how do you impart to your kids to not repeat that? Because it seems like we're in this thing where we will always end up with this thing of being in a cycle of coming to calamity the moment that your society reaches the point where it continuously forgets what it went through. The school thing has to do more with the notion of not necessarily getting rid of a person's humanity. I would argue expanding it to where your individual life experience is expanded to the point of multiple individual life experiences. So you are still you. Whatever that little bit of logic that was there when you gain consciousness, that's still there. The only difference here is we're bouncing that against multiple experiences, multiple lifetimes, and everything else in order to understand, A, whether or not there's an individual that goes beyond just, the nuts and bolts, basically just the physicality of this, meaning consciousness, meaning is that person just that person because of the experience that person went through, or is there something unique and specific about that particular individual that when he deals with all of these experiences, it comes out with a unique point of view? I'm not trying to get rid of the point of view of those people. What I'm trying to do is expand it so they can understand other people's lives and other people's experiences within the context of their own growth. So none of this
Before we go to calls, it reminds me of, do you know the book A Theory of Justice, or The Idea, by John Rawls? It's a pretty famous book. Are you familiar with this?
The name is familiar. John Rawls is familiar.
So basically the idea is that like you should construct a society. It sort of has to do with Kant and social contract theory, but you should construct a society so that basically if you were to be any random person in that society, you'd be pretty much happy with the state of affairs. So it's this idea, this sort of complete egalitarian view. That's sort of what you're saying, but with this simulationist perspective.
I think so. I guess I'm trying to get across to people that you and I are basically alike, meaning everybody around the world. And in those people being alike, they have certain needs, they have certain drives, they have certain things that they require to make them whole. And sometimes those things change, but sometimes you get a certain degree of selfishness and alienation where the individual functions entirely for their own wants, as if their actions don't necessarily have consequences to other people on the planet. The solution, or the techno solution, if you want to call it that, just has to do with trying to get people to realize that their life is just one of billions. And in the same way that they have things that they want, things that they need to be happy, things that they need to be care about or compassionate about, that those things also extend to every other person on this planet. And that maybe if that connection could be forged in a way that is more visceral, meaning living in these multiple lives, that maybe society can reach a higher point where it no longer considers the other as being an enemy. That there's a certain degree of trust from that lived experience that you would be able to draw from your time in going to school. That's where I'm coming at it from.
I hear that is idealistic. Is it cool if we go to calls? Are you cool with that, Jamarl?
Yeah, totally. They're massively idealistic, massively so. Massively
and
so.
sort of spiritual. And I don't mean to diminish it by saying idealistic, because you know me, I'm pretty idealistic too. But it's also a spiritual take. And I thought, you don't think so?
I don't take it as no. I'm saying I don't take it as a negative to be called either idealistic or spiritual.
No, and I just mean even with spiritual, I just mean sort of deeper and fundamentally ethical and sort of a self-facing and self-descriptive and self-opening view. I don't know. A lot of stuff to unpack there, but we've got callers. Adam from Colorado. Adam, you're on the line. What's going on, Adam?
Hey, morning, guys. So wanted to start with saying you're touching on numerous topics here. First one, the simulation is a similar formulation to brain in a vat. How would you know that you're in a vat if every other experience seems to be the same as if you were still in your body? But beyond that, you also have the futurism argument here that someday we'll advance far enough so that things can actually be better for everyone. I want to give a dystopian representation on the path that we're currently on. Basically, by 2030, they're estimating about 38% unemployment in the U.S. This is PricewaterhouseCoopers UK study published. It was a white paper 2017. By 2050, it could be as high as 80%. Now, why is that important? It's because the automation is not necessarily to benefit all of society, but rather to replace the workers so that you have a more reliable source of labor that doesn't ever get tired and doesn't rebel. So then the top 20% suppresses the lower 80%, including by force through automated weapons, which is currently being developed by our government and other governments.
Adam, I'm going to cut it. I'm sorry, I'm going to cut it there. You call in. You're very informative, and you inform yourself. It's just we've got another caller to get to real quick. Yeah, that is the big with automation. I mean, I think the criticism that the vast majority of people have, unless you're opposed to automation per se, unless you don't like the technological aspects of sort of runaway growth, those aspects of things, unless you're more of a Luddite on more end of the spectrum. Usually the criticism is, like you're saying, that the gains from the profits are going to be disproportionately distributed, and it's going to be the capitalists, it's going to be the people who own that the means of production, that automative stuff, the robots and whatnot, who are going to benefit from it, and specifically ownership of that property.
Not just the gains.
I mean, real quick.
That's not just the gains.
The property itself.
He's talking about
not just the gains.
Yeah. Well, he's talking about
but also
even
just the jobs.
The jobs, the workers themselves. Well, the workers lose power the moment they get displaced, and you don't have something in your society that ensures that those people are made whole. And what he's talking about is basically robots taking over those positions, workers being disenfranchised, and then with military and whatnot being used to basically suppress the masses.
Totally. Yeah, I almost shouldn't have commented because I knew I would get it. I knew I would get it incomplete, and we've got another caller to get to.
Okay, let's go, Karen.
Yeah, Karen from Maryland, you're on the line. What's going on, Karen?
Okay, hi there. I'm glad you all are open-minded and pretty much allow any and all dialogue. Let's drastically change the subject. What is your opinion about why those that are incarcerated in many states are not allowed to vote? Why do so many states not welcome and disallow the incarcerated vote? What's your explanation for that?
Well, the original reason... Okay, Shane.
I believe that there's a shift in the nature of what it means to be a citizen once you've committed a felony, and there's like this question of how that should affect your citizenship or your rights as a citizen. And so there's a conversation around that, but I think that's the sort of pivotal issue. I mean, then there are all these pragmatic considerations, that relate to potential political bias, all that stuff. But just axiomatically, I think that's what it comes down to in the conversations. What's your take, Jamarl?
The thing is, though, that if you have so many people in prison where those prisoners are able to affect the voting thing, maybe they should be able to affect the voting thing if you have that many people in prison. And also part of this was it was used to get rid of those votes. Like, if you're talking about Nixon and the drug war, part of that was when we lock a person up, like you said, there's a change in their citizenship status, and at which point we can now make certain declarations about whether they're actually a citizen or whether they actually have the right to vote. So, Karen, look, I think they should be able to vote. I think if you have that many inmates that is causing a shift in your politics, then there's something fundamentally wrong with where you are that is creating that many convicts. But let's go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
On Sputnik with Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert. Tune in.
Well, maybe mention like central bankers and markets are doubling down. Not you're saying everybody.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. A quick note. If you're listening to us right now, you're listening to us, but you might want to listen to us some other way than the way you're currently listening to us. I'll start with a few. We have a bunch of options. I'll start with the radio. If you're in the DC area, you can catch us 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, 102.9 and 104.7 FM. Also, 1140 AM. We're also online on audio. You can listen to us iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher. If you want to listen to us and watch us at the same time, or in some cases watch a graphic of us, you can do a search on YouTube, Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. You'll see our two channels popping up. Both of those have a live feed. Also, last but definitely not least, on Twitter, just go to twitter.com/FaultLinesRadio. You'll see us there. Follow us, and you'll see right up top, there's the Periscope. You can watch that Periscope feed there, Fault Lines Radio. We have with us now my dad. I'll just start like that. Leith Stranahan, host of Populist TV and director of Citizen Journalism School. We're talking about Strobe Talbot today. Lee, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. All right, so we're talking about Strobe Talbot, Cody Shearer, and Christopher Steele. We're talking about the origins of this one branch of Russiagate. You've done more and better work than anybody else I've seen on this issue, and it seems to be paying off. You were talking about this months ago, in some cases years ago, but you really got into Strobe Talbot and Cody Shearer within the last year or two. And then within the last couple of weeks, they're investigating the connections. They're investigating the communications that would have set the Steele dossier up through its predecessor, the Shearer dossier. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Can you go back to the beginning, and can you starting from where we are now, go back to what you see as the real origin story here that you think a lot of people are probably missing on this narrative?
Well, yeah, there's two things to, I think, understanding the Russiagate story that are very important, and this affects both of them. Almost everybody gets both of these things wrong. Number one, the perception, obviously worldwide, but particularly in the U.S., and particularly among Trump supporters, is that Russiagate was an operation against Donald Trump. And that is not really the case. Obviously, it affected the Trump administration. That's true. But I'm going to argue that the primary target of Russiagate was relations with Russia, and in particular, Vladimir Putin. This was, in other words, if you look at this as an anti-Trump operation, you're really only getting part of the story. If you look at it as part of an ongoing, decades-long move against Vladimir Putin, and there's a reason for it as well, and I'll talk about that in a second. if you look at it that way, things start to make sense. And we'll talk about how these new developments tie directly into that. The second thing is that this is a Clinton operation primarily. You had Tom Luongo on the show the other day. He expressed the view, and a lot of people have expressed this, that they think it's a Obama operation. Obama was involved. The Obama administration was very involved. But again, for reasons that I'll state, very, very clearly, this is a Clinton operation. And the Russia aspect of it ties in directly to people who are Bill Clinton's longest, closest friends and political allies for over 50 years. And that's who you mentioned, Strobe Talbot, who was the Oxford flatmate of Bill Clinton, and Strobe Talbot's brothers-in-law, Cody Shearer and Derek Shearer. And I'll talk about the Shearer family in a second. Let me go back to that first point and explain the real long game here. So you had the fall of the Soviet Union. In the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, there was, in the 90s, a lot of people in the world weren't really paying much attention to Russia. They were like, okay, communism fell. They played a Pink Floyd song at the Berlin Wall. Great, we're covered. Okay, that's all we need to worry about. But for a lot of people, there was money to be made. And very few people were paying attention to this, particularly in the United States. But the political leadership under Bill Clinton's administration absolutely was. Now, the point man on Russia for Bill Clinton was Strobe Talbot. And again, this is somebody who's known Clinton since 1969, when they were flatmates together in Oxford, when Bill Clinton was there on a Rhodes Scholarship. And Talbot at the time was a Russian studies major who was actually translating Khrushchev's memoirs. So he was already, at Oxford, a Russian expert. And when Bill Clinton's political rise happened, Strobe Talbot came along. And that political rise was aided by the Shearer family. So feel free to stop me, but pretty clear so far on this?
100%. Yeah, and one thing I just want to throw in there, I mean, Strobe Talbot, for people who aren't on a first-name basis, Deputy Secretary of State from 1994 to 2001, so during the Clinton administration. So the relationship that you're talking about that started back in the late 60s was carried forward. You're not just talking about a sort of lone player or some lone thing. This was a long-lasting relationship, and you can see that by his influence as Deputy Secretary of State during the Clinton administration, also president of Brookings for about 15 years, Brookings Institution from 2002 to 2017. So for people who aren't familiar, not a marginal player when it comes to foreign policy and setting the agenda on this stuff.
No, and there's a huge article about Strobe Talbot came out during the Clinton administration. It seems like it's about 4,000 word article. And it was said that the Russians thought that Talbot was a CIA operative. They thought that when he was doing work, he was going back and forth, they thought he was a CIA operative. So the connections of this to the CIA as well go way back. Now, another interesting thing about Strobe Talbot that's significant is people know Victoria Nuland, who was heading up the Ukraine operation, and by the way, brought in by Hillary Clinton. Strobe Talbot's assistant when he was in the White House was Victoria Nuland. When he was part of the Clinton administration, I mean, he worked at State, I believe.
Well, that's very interesting.
Victoria Nuland.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that. So that's the connection. I mean, a prominent connection there to Ukraine.
Lee, the Shearer thing, for people who weren't necessarily paying attention to this, I remember you and I spoke about this when I was on the show once before, and the Shearer document had came out and started getting a little bit more publicity. What is the Shearer dossier, meaning the dossier that was created using information from Cody Shearer, as compared to the Steele dossier? How were they different, and how did they play on one another?
Well, first off, the Shearer dossier was the basis for the Steele dossier. And we know that because of
there's a court case. Christopher Steele's being sued in London. And so as part of those lawsuits, he's already lost one defamation lawsuit from these guys connected with Alpha Bank. And there's another one going on now. So because of things that he said about people in the dossier, he's being sued in London. He's also being sued in the U.S., but most of those suits have gotten tossed. So, but these suits in London produce testimony that's very significant to this. One of the things that came out is the Shearer dossier was given to Steele, and it was used as part of the FISA warrants. So to understand why this is significant, let's talk about who the Shearer family is. They're not well known. They're shadowy figures generally. Cody Shearer, there's very little about him. You can find an article from the 1990s that basically calls him a shadowy figure, and it's not from a right-wing publication. Now, who are the Shearers? And they're very significant in the Clintons' political ascendancy for both Bill and Hillary Clinton. The father of Cody Shearer and Derek Shearer was Lloyd Shearer. Now, Lloyd Shearer was the editor of Parade magazine, which was a Sunday supplement, would come out in your Sunday paper. And at one point, he had 75 million readers. So I want to point out, now what he did was a column called Walter Scott's Personality Parade. And that column was used to help Clinton. So let's explain the relationship here. 1968, Strobe Talbot is at Yale. He graduates Yale. His roommate is Derek Shearer. We'll talk about Derek in a second, only after the break, because it's very significant. Strobe Talbot, 1968, his roommate's Derek Shearer. He meets Derek's sister, Brooke Shearer. Brooke Shearer has subsequently passed away. She died a few years ago. But Strobe Talbot meets, falls in love with, and marries Brooke Shearer. Now, so now you've got the three children, Cody, Derek, and Brooke. And they are key to the Clintons' political rise. First off, Lloyd Shearer is a celebrity columnist, and he introduces them to a lot of people, including Henry Kissinger, people like that. This is all in Lloyd Shearer's obituary when he passed away a few years ago. But the significant thing now is that Cody Shearer worked to help get Bill Clinton elected very directly. By the way, they would use the column. They would use the Walter Scott's Personality Parade column to say, for instance, that Bill Clinton wasn't a womanizer. They would specifically use it to plant information. And the way we know this is Derek Shearer wrote after Clinton was elected. He wrote like a 6-page letter to Bill and Hillary and said, I believe in political friendship, but I also believe in political debt. That's how he starts it. And he goes on to outline all the stuff that they did to help the Clintons, including Cody Shearer working with Sid Blumenthal to put down the womanizing stories, the Jennifer Flowers story, and these other ones. And Derek, it's a 6-page letter where he outlines everything he did. He said Brooke was on the bus with Hillary. And by the way, Brooke Shearer would become Hillary Clinton's, one of her closest aides in the Clinton White House, and she was on the bus in the election. So again, these are people who go back as far as you can go with the Clintons. And this amazing letter, which, by the way, we know it's real because it was part of Derek Shearer's papers that he gave to Brown University. They outline everything that they did. And sure enough, Derek Shearer's made the ambassador to Finland after that by Bill Clinton. That's the payback. But there's more with Derek Shearer. But the significant thing in that letter is he outlines that Cody was working with Sidney Blumenthal closely. And you have that same pair of people, Cody Shearer and Sid Blumenthal, prepare a dossier prior to the Steele dossier. It was the first one. And so what I'm going to say is my theory on this is that, and for good reason, is that Shearer dossier not only is the first dossier, but that they hired Steele to give legitimacy to these false claims about Russia and Trump. That the reason they brought Steele in was as cover for the Shearer dossier, because they knew if they went to the FBI with a dossier from Sidney Blumenthal and a known Clinton operative, it doesn't look good. So I know we got to go to a break soon, but that's probably a good break point there to set us up for the other stuff that all directly relates to the Russiagate story and the Shearers that no one talks about.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We have Leith Stranahan, host of Populist TV and director of Citizen Journalism School. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for Chan speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined by my dad, Leith Stranahan, today. We're talking about Strobe Talbott, Cody Shearer, and Christopher Steele. Lee is an investigative journalist, intrepid investigative journalist, longtime investigative journalist, and the host of Populist.tv and the director of Citizen Journalism School. So we were talking again about the history, the relationship between Strobe Talbott and Bill Clinton, between Strobe Talbott and the Shearer family, and between Clinton and the Shearer family, specifically through Lloyd Shearer, who gave him inroads with a lot of very prominent figures, gave him a media outlet and a platform there. One quick note I'll throw in here, we probably won't have time to get into this too much today, but there's also the connection between Cody Shearer and Brett Kimberlin. Obviously, you're way more familiar with that than I am. But and then, of course, Brett Kimberlin connects to Alexandra Chalupa. So there's this other weird connection in this Clinton network that ties in. And the Shearer, when did that happen? When was the Shearer association between with Kimberlin and Dan Quayle? What decade and what year was that, Lee?
Well, yeah. Let me talk about that because that's what I want. So now, if you understand who the Shearer family is, Derek Shearer is now at Occidental College. We'll talk about him. He's very significant here. Cody Shearer, longtime Clinton operative. I've spoken to Kathleen Willey. She's one of the people who accused Bill Clinton of sexually assaulting her. She believes that Cody Shearer went to her house, but we know that they were involved in the woman stuff. Derek Shearer outlines it. Brooke Shearer, Strobe Talbott's wife, now deceased, as close as you can get to Hillary Clinton. Again, these people, the Shearers and Strobe Talbott, really that whole family goes back to, like you say, Bill Clinton's Oxford days. So when you understand who they are, let's start to take some of these history and now bring it right into the Russiagate story. So Alexandra Chalupa, as you mentioned, she's the Ukrainian American who went to the embassy, Ukrainian embassy, and said, I want you to not help the Trump campaign. And we're looking for dirt on the Trump campaign. And we're looking for dirt on Paul Manafort. And this is admitted by Chalupa. And again, she's never appeared before Congress or anything, but we know she did this. And she was working in the campaign with a guy named Brett Kimberlin. Brett Kimberlin is a convicted bomber. He set off a series of bombs in Indiana as a convicted felon, but he was used by the Clintons in the 92 campaign. And what happened was Brett Kimberlin, if you're old like me, you remember this story. There was a story about a guy who sold pot to Dan Quayle, UBP. And that guy from prison making that claim was Brett Kimberlin. Now, no newspaper would publish that claim because there was no proof for it. And the guy is not just a convicted felon, but he was a large-scale drug dealer. I don't mean a dime bag dealer. I mean bringing millions, tons of, of drugs in. So he's not a real reliable source. He's convicted of perjury at the time he was 19. So no newspaper would publish that. So the way they got it out into the media was the Doonesbury cartoon, Gary Trudeau's Doonesbury, did a series of cartoons, not columns, cartoons, because Doonesbury was in every paper about Brett Kimberlin claiming to have sold weed Dan Quayle. And again, if you look up Brett Kimberlin, Doonesbury, you'll find them. You can find them online. The guy who set up Gary Trudeau and Brett Kimberlin was Cody Scherer. And again, this is admitted. This has happened around 92 during that campaign. There's an article from 1991 in the Hartford Courant where they say Cody Scherer is the person. So I'm going to point out once again that Brett Kimberlin being involved in Russiagate, and Brett's a guy who I've had run-ins with for years, was shocking to me. But it's completely confirmed the DNC was working with a convicted bomber, and by the way, went up to Capitol Hill after Trump was elected. They were trying to keep Trump from taking office. Chalupa and Brett Kimberlin were meeting with Congress people. Keith Ellison, for instance, were meeting with Congress people trying to devise a way to keep Trump from taking office. And again,
one quick note here. I want to throw this in with Manafort. I mean, Trump's campaign manager at the time. I believe a lot of this was taking place in like early 2016, but I believe it was March 2016. Hasn't it come out in the past couple of weeks? Not just that Christopher Steele, the identity of his subsource, we can get into that, but that they were specifically looking into these same allegations about Manafort during that same time period. So this other weird connection, not just in terms of people, but in terms of the time when they were actually looking into this stuff in 2016.
Yes, this is huge. Now I've been talking about Stroke Talbot. We've known that Steele had what's been called the primary subsource, which is what was heretofore unidentified until last week. There's a guy on Twitter, Stephen McIntyre, Climate Audit is his name on Twitter. He does very good work, and he's been following these stories for a while. And he noticed that there were clues that you could use to determine who seemed to be the primary subsource. And he found it was a guy named Igor Darchenko. And he is, Darchenko, first off, connections to Ukraine. Second off, he worked at Brookings on Russia for about 5 years. So at the time Strobe Talbot was running it, Strobe ran it, like you say, for close to 20 years, basically. Strobe Talbot ran Brookings. And by the way, Victoria Nuland is connected to Brookings. Her husband, Robert Kagan, is one of not just a leading neocon, but a major fellow at Brookings. So again, that connection. But by the way, another interesting thing to note about Victoria Nuland, she also worked for Dick Cheney as his assistant. So she's not a Democrat operative; she's a neocon operative, and she'll work for Cheney. She'll work for Strobe Talbot. Doesn't make any difference. And so the idea that this guy Igor Darchenko was not known to Strobe Talbot is impossible. Strobe Talbot was his boss, and he was working on the issue Russia that Strobe Talbot's an expert in. I mean, this is, that's his bailiwick. And so for him to be there was significant. And this, as you point out, it only came out in the past couple of weeks. The other thing that broke is that now the Senate is looking into these people, and they're also looking into Jonathan Weiner. looking into all the State Department people. Now because we only have a few minutes. I want to make sure this part comes out. Derek Shearer is directly connected to the subject of the Trump Tower meeting. Let me explain that. The Trump Tower meeting, which was used to say, oh, look, Trump's colluding with the Russians. Oh, look, right? And, a lot of fallout from that. That was about Bill Browder and the Magnitsky Act. And specifically, it was about Browder working with these billionaires, the Ziff brothers. The Ziff brothers are heirs to a publishing fortune, big Democrat donors here in the United States. And they were working with Bill Browder to try to acquire shares of a Russian gas company, okay? That company, Ziff Brothers Investment, is trying to get shares in a Russian gas company at a time when foreign investment was limited. And they did it through a series of shell companies. Derek Shearer works for has worked for Ziff Brothers Investments. Anybody can just type in Derek Shearer, D-E-R-E-K, Shearer, Occidental, see his biography on the Occidental College page, where, by the way, one of the things he does is he heads up a Barack Obama-connected endowment there. But it says he worked for Ziff Brothers Investments. Now, again, there's no reason to think that he's an investment expert. He's nothing in his background that he was, like you say, he's ambassador to Finland, but he's not an economist. The reason they had him there, I believe, was for his political juice. And so, in other words, Derek Shearer, and by the way, I mentioned they were using shell companies. If you look in Shearer's biography, you'll see he's at it sounds very impressive, the McKinnon Center for Global Security or something like that at Occidental. Well, McKinnon is Ian McKinnon, who is an executive at Ziff Brothers. So in other words, there's this, he basically heads up this thing. I don't even know how it was created. And you can find Ian McKinnon's bio there. And on those shell companies, Ian McKinnon's name is one of the guys in the shell companies. So really what they're hiding, among other things, is the connection of one of Bill Clinton's oldest and closest friends, an ambassador in the Clinton administration, directly connected to the company that Natalia Veselnitskaya, the Russian lawyer, was trying to warn Trump about, rightfully, because they're tax scammers who were trying to avoid taxes in Russia and the U.S. And she told them that. And of course, now she's kept from coming into the country. So these connections are, like I say, deep, long-standing, and very significant to Russiagate.
Lee, let me ask you this. We have about maybe 2.5 minutes before we end it. I think the woman's name is Shakiba. I may be pronouncing it wrong. In fact, I know I'm pronouncing it wrong. I can see it, even though I'm having a hard time pronouncing it. She was instrumental in working with Ukraine or elements of the Ukraine in order to get information on Manafort. This is what Shane was talking about earlier, where basically, at the same time that she was actively trying to get information for the DNC, she supposedly wasn't associated with the DNC, but it just so happened the information she was looking for was just so happened the information that Ukraine was giving. Can you explain a little bit more with this relationship and how significant this was, even though, for the most part, many people would not even know who that woman's name is?
Well, on Chalupa, you mean?
That's it, Chalupa.
You mean, yes. So Alexandra Chalupa and her sister Andrea are Ukrainian activists. They're American. They were born and raised in California, but their family not only has a connection to the Ukraine, but to the CIA as well. Their uncle was who they talk about still, was a CIA operative. And this was after World War II. And it's significant because after World War II, of course, Russia helped us win World War II and helped the Allies win World War II significantly. But after the end of the war, they became public enemy number one for the CIA. And so the significance of the Chalupa family's connection to the CIA going back decades is also very, very significant, because the CIA, like Eric Carmella, show up everywhere in this. And he knew Alexander.
Thank you, Lee. We're out of time. We'll be back. We hope to get you back on pretty soon. Keep talking about this stuff. Also go into the last bit we were talking about there with Ukraine, the history of the Chalupa family, Mykola Lebed, all that. Lee Stranahan, host of Populist TV and director of Citizen Journalism School. We'll be back on Monday. Thank you so much for listening to this week of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, as always, I thank you for joining us. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We have, there's a super chat that I want to read from Wesley Walker. This one goes to Shane. It's too bad he was joking. It was a good list. He's talking about the list that Shane gave earlier, where he was like, the announcement that the aliens have landed on this particular thing, or we're in a virtual reality, or $1,400 or $1,200, I think he said, a week. And he was like, okay, maybe none of that stuff. No, I agree with the entire list. I agree with you, Wesley Walker. I like the entire list. One last point. We helped Russia win that war, not the other way around. Russia lost 20 million people, if not more, and it was every bit as much as a war of extermination of trying to destroy the Soviet Union, and Hitler called cultural Marxism or whatever the hell that was. But basically, he tried to make an argument that the Soviet Union was Jewish, and that the whole point of Marxism or communism or whatever had a basis in this kind of Jewish ideology. Hitler was trying to destroy and use the Soviet Union's vast space as living space. What is it? Lebensraum, or however you pronounce it. But what that basically means, though, is that you're clearing out and killing or keeping a certain amount of people as slaves. But you're talking about millions dead. 20 million Russians died in that war. And if Hitler got what he wanted, that number would have been much, much, much higher. Utterly just astonishing what he wanted to do in that area. I understand that Hitler went into a war of extermination against the Jews. Fair enough. But I think it's also fair to say that it was also a war of extermination against the Soviet Union and the Russians. So, small point of contention, but I would make the case that we lost maybe 200,000. I don't think we lost even that many. 300,000 at the most, I think. Or 500,000 at the most, but I don't think it was that many. But the Russians lost millions and millions of people. But let's end it here. You guys listen to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to thank you all for joining us on the show, and I will be seeing you guys a little later today. Thanks all.